This is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast. I am co-host David Pietrzewski, and
Almost
my
forgot your last name there.
I was gonna, well, it wouldn't be that difficult to forget my
Yeah.
last name. I was gonna, well, it doesn't matter. I was gonna say David Pinsoff, but then I had already said so you're David Pinsoff. I'm David Pietrzewski.
And this is Actual Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, Actual Evolutionary Psychology.
By actual evolutionary psychologists.
Enjoy.
David, today we have a wonderful guest, Patrick Durkee. Patrick does work confronting our folk intuitions about constructs like personality, for example. So he's done work with people like Aaron Lukashevsky, confronting the idea that as psychologists had sort of traditionally assumed personality was just there existing in the mind, he's been doing work kind of thinking about, well, what would an adaptationist approach to this be? And very much in the Michael Graziano point of sometimes the first step is the wrong step, and assuming naively that the intuitive constructs like personality exist in the mind is sort of the wrong step. And so this is a lovely example of confronting what is personality, or what else do we talk about? Status, like what is status? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you might think naively that status is a simple thing and status seeking and status hierarchies are a simple thing. But in this episode, we really delve into the unfathomable complexity of what status is and how it touches on virtually every aspect of our lives, how it interacts with our personalities, how we look for niches to fill in our social world, and how social ecologies can affect our status seeking strategies, and how, moral progress can change what status games we play. We even get into inspiration and what it means to be inspired to pursue a particular endeavor. This was a really fun, wide-ranging conversation. I think you'll
It,
like it a lot.
it was an inspirational episode. And we even get into like what are emotions or personality? What is personality from the perspective of like, is personality sort of in a weird way the opposite of what free will is? Like, I like this
Right.
very cool thing that we're getting into. So by drilling down into the mechanistic details of the adaptations, we're also sort of making the familiar strange, to use that lovely quote that John and Lita used. That was a quote from William James. So this is a
Yep.
lovely, inspiring, and nicely strange episode with Patrick Durkee.
Agreed. Enjoy. Patrick Durkee, it's lovely to have you here. Um, you are an expert in status, in personality, in different types of status, and how personality traits might affect status acquisition and how good you are at seeking status. Why don't we begin at the beginning and just try to define what status is? What exactly are we talking about?
Oh, Jesus, starting with
Or
the
personality,
hardest
either one.
hardest possible
Yeah,
problem, I
Yeah,
guess.
it can
take
either
your
start
pick.
with status, personality, or what a definition is generally. That's
Yeah,
and
or
Yeah.
justice or truth, whichever
Yeah.
whichever one is easiest for you.
reality.
Yeah. Well, I think if you like look in the literature, like the definition of status that I think you'd see most often is something like the average kind of differences in attention, deference, control over resources, basically, that people have within a group.
Okay.
And yeah, I think that generally, like that's kind of the definition I've been working with, but maybe just because that's the definition that is out there in the literature. I
Okay.
think like really what like I've been trying to work towards is more like, yeah, what is status like within the mind in a
Hmm.
computational sense? Or is status even a thing in the mind per se, or is it an emergent kind of thing that comes out of the computations going on in the mind and what those computations actually look like, I guess.
So if people pay attention to me and listen to what I say, and if I tell them to do things and they listen to me and they do it, and I have lots of stuff, then by your definition and by the definition in the academic literature, I have high status.
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And it seems to me that we also kind of need an explanation for why all of those things go together. Because in theory, they could be decoupled. It could be that I have lots of stuff, but nobody listens to me or cares what I have to say. It could be that everyone obeys my every command, but I'm very poor. So, why do you think these things go together?
I guess the behavioral outputs like deference, attention, like might be outputs of similar systems or the same system that depend on the same inputs, I suppose,
Mhm.
is one. And one of those inputs might be something like, yeah, resource holding potential, which is, from the animal like ecology literature, like an organism's ability to take or defend resources from other organisms, and oh, and also willingness to do that.
Right. Okay. So I maybe, if you have lots of stuff, maybe I'll listen to you because you have the power to give me some of that stuff.
Hmm.
And I'll obey your command because if I do, then maybe you'll share your stuff with me. And if I'm rude to you or I don't listen to you, then you're not going to share your stuff with me. Is that?
Hmm.
And so, are there different types of status? Because I know a lot of people in the literature think there are different types of status. Where do you fall in that
Hmm.
debate?
Yeah, I mean, in the literature, the biggest kind of popular distinction is between dominance on the one hand and prestige as different forms or different strategies or different routes to attaining status. And
Hmm.
so, like, yeah, it gets a little dicey for me anyway, because I think really there's like there's status, and I view dominance and prestige as different routes or different strategies to attaining status, at least that's in the literature. But I think it's also probably possible to think about these as completely like distinct forms of status. And maybe they're not even leading to the same outcome at like having status as an outcome of these things. And I think that that's contributed to a lot of confusion maybe in literature and in my own mind about like what it is we're actually talking about when we're talking about status and
Mhm.
the role of dominance and prestige in human status hierarchies.
Mhm. I've been thinking a bit about status myself. Um, and I kind of want to run a definition by you, or at least how
Mhm.
I'm thinking about it, and see if you agree with me or not.
Yeah.
So I've been thinking about status as common knowledge of a person's relative value as a social partner, and its downstream consequences on coalitions and alliances.
Hmm.
So this doesn't really assume that much because we already should have systems in the mind for evaluating the value of different social partners, given that we are in a marketplace of partners. We're shopping around for potential friends, for potential mates, for potential people to lead us in joint activities. Uh, we have some choice about who we're going to collaborate with. And in order to make good choices in that marketplace, we need to have some way of computing the value of different choices, right? And so if someone is just really valuable as a social partner, then it benefits me to pay attention to them and to try to be nice to them and form a relationship with them just because they're higher value. And then the common knowledge of it is important because if I think you're really awesome, but everyone else thinks you suck, well, then you're not actually very awesome because a big part of your awesomeness is common knowledge of that awesomeness. Because um, i- if you have lots of people who will take your side or cooperate with you, you're going to be a much more valuable partner. But if everybody hates you and I'm the only one on your side, that's going to be really bad for me.
Hmm.
So it's not just your value, it's also we all need to know that everyone knows that you're awesome or that you're superior as a social partner. And once we all have common knowledge that you are a really good social partner, well, it benefits us all to take your side in conflicts
Hmm.
and to try to form political alliances with you. If there's some sort of political conflict where you're going to benefit and someone else is going to pay a cost, if you're the better partner, then it benefits everyone else to take your side. And if I know that everyone's going to take your side, then that benefits me even more if I'm going to take your side because I'm going to be in the majority. And so when there's common knowledge of your superior value, that creates a strong political incentive for all of us to have your back, to take your side, to oppose your enemies and support your friends, and to avoid ganging up on you and gang up on your rivals, say, or to imitate you, to try to signal our loyalty to you. So that's how I'm thinking of it. It's common knowledge of a person's relative social value and its political implications. What do you think about that way of thinking of it?
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think it's closely aligned with like how, for example, Aaron Lucheski and I have kind of talked about it too, which is kind of thinking about it like status is, or like your representation of somebody's status in your social world is kind of capturing like your assessment of the collective like welfare trade-off ratios that people have towards that person.
Mm.
Where, but I like the way you put it too. We're just recognizing somebody's like relative social value as a cooperator or something like that. And yeah, because again, that helps you, like you said, kind of figure out like what are some good strategic alliances to make, who should I support in conflict, who should I defer to because they have XYZ people backing them up, and
Mhm.
that sort of thing. And it's very similar to, for example, like when I took a class with John Patton back in the day, like right at the beginning of when I was getting into evolutionary psychology. It's very similar to how he viewed status as well, as this kind of
Mm.
like marker of who's got the coalitional support behind them and who has
Mhm.
more coalitional support. And again, that really does tie in with the biological literature in a lot of ways, just with more individuals. And when it comes down to resource holding potential, it's if things came down to in a conflict over a resource or a decision, um, who has more resource holding potential in order to win that conflict. And the thing that makes it trickier in humans, or apparent seemingly trickier in humans, is that the way you get more people on your side in a conflict is not by forcing them, probably, to fight for you. Maybe that works in some situations, but probably an easier thing is to have people just genuinely want you around and want you to continue to exist and want you to have things your way, either because that benefits them or because they actually value you so highly that they just want you to have things a certain way.
So
That's yeah. Oh, go ahead, David.
I was just gonna maybe segue into where personality fits into this picture. Do some personality traits lend themselves to status seeking or higher status? Um, do we seek status in different ways based on our personality? What do you think is the role between personality and status?
Yeah, so I think it might help, yeah, to kind of back up into still stay in the maybe the status realm a little bit and figure out,
Okay.
yeah. So if you want to know like what personality traits might be useful for getting status, navigating status hierarchies, maybe we should make a little bit more explicit like well, how do you get status in the first
Mhm.
place? Like what is the currency of status, I think, and
Yeah.
which we've already kind of been talking about a little bit with this like dominance versus prestige distinction and figuring out like what is status. So I guess if we were going to work with like this definition that status is like this collective recognition of basically other people valuing you and being willing to come to your defense or your
Mhm.
aid over
Mhm.
in a conflict, then we have to figure out like how do you get people to increase their valuation of you is the key there. It's just going back like to the logic of cost and benefits, right? That's something we've talked a lot about is it should be generating benefits for people. So either you're really good at generating benefits for people, or at least you're willing and or you're willing to try to do those things. So this is actually like a to be comment at one of my talks, like as my first year of PhD student, I was talking about some of my status work and talking about, yeah, like generating benefits versus generating costs. And he was basically like, well, shouldn't you split these into like ability and willingness to do these things? Because maybe they don't always go together. You can be able to generate costs, but I mean, yeah, able to inflict costs or able to generate benefits, but you're not particularly like willing to do any of those things. And that really changes the kind of calculus for me as a potential victim or beneficiary of those said costs or benefits to know, are you willing to impose costs on me? Or are you just able to? Are
Mhm.
you willing to generate benefits? Do you specifically want to generate benefits for me?
Mhm.
Or are you just able to do that?
Right. And also, I would imagine it's obligatory, like, which is a weird way to think, but sort of just there's some things where I can't control it or you can take advantage of it. So if I
Hmm.
just am really good at doing something, just for example, no, but yeah, like, like, I don't know, like I can build really good wells or something, a dumb example like that, but then you benefit, it's an externality, but I can't monopolize it, then my willingness doesn't matter in that context. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so it is like separable. They don't always have to go together. You don't have to be both able and willing, but both of those are aspects of the decision about like how much status or how much of another person value you.
Hmm. No,
Yeah.
that's really interesting point, Dave, that there is an aspect of benefiting from someone that is independent of willingness. Like you could just benefit me by accident. You know,
Yeah.
Yeah.
just by, uh, for example, building a well that maybe you're just building the well because you personally want water. Well, as soon as you build that well, it's available for me to use as well. And so you may hate me and you may not care about me at all, but your mere ability to build the well is a benefit to me in the same way that, a tree's existence is a benefit to me if I can sit in its shade. The tree doesn't actually care about me, but its existence is beneficial to me. So that's another aspect that you can think of as willingness, ability, and the externalities of the person's
Mhm.
activities as
Yeah,
well.
I even wonder like famous people sort of sometimes complain about people feeling or like feeling like people don't actually care about them. And I wonder if that's like an example of this psychology where like if I'm buddies with Harrison Ford, I'm walking down the street, I get status just by virtue of like being around him, right? For me as the hanger on, I'm just sort of looking at it as like I'm using Harrison Ford to get some status because just the knowledge that like I have a picture with him or I'm just next to him gives me status. Harrison Ford can't sort of control that, right? And so I think that that expression um, that people aren't actually interested in me because they're using me to get status in some other way suggests like that there's the psychology assessing whether it's obligatory or not.
So it's really complicated.
Yeah.
Willingness, ability, externality. These are hard problems for the mind to solve because it's not clear, just by looking at someone's behavior, listening to what they say, it's not clear how to carve that up into things they can do, things they're willing to do, things that are just happening by accident as an externality or as a byproduct of their activities. Do you have any inkling about how we solve these problems, of how we figure out like who's capable of conferring benefits or who's willing or whose activities are beneficial to us?
Yeah, I think at like a certainly a rough kind of level. It's something I've been thinking about, but I also like recognize like something I came to recently and doing some, I guess I call them agent-based models, like trying to figure out how an agent figure out like what things increase status, like what things, like how important is cost infliction versus benefit generation in getting status in my local community. And at least in the models that I've been working with, like I have to already imbue the agent with an idea of benefit versus cost. And obviously, I have no idea how how that really works. Like, how do we know whether something is a benefit or a cost? Like, I guess Daniel Sneeser's work touches on the value. How do you figure out what the value of things are? And maybe
Mhm.
some of that is over deep evolutionary time, you can get some good priors going about certain things. But a lot of things related to status, I think, are pretty culturally variable or variable across contexts or across time about their relative usefulness or their relative cost or benefit potential. And so it would require, yeah, an agent to kind of figure out through an organism to figure out throughout development, like what are the relative values of different acts or characteristics or events? Like what events should I want to happen versus not want to happen? What are some characteristics that would be good to cultivate or skills that would be good to learn? Or what are some actions that are good to do for status versus not good to do for status? So kind of the way I'm putting it together now is yeah, trying to say like if an agent is born in with some like rough, maybe some rough priors, that costs and benefits are a core dimension or two dimensions of accruing status in your local social world, then how do you just figure out the relative importance of each? Yeah, like of all the things you could do, what's like the rank ordering of things that would be good for generating benefits? And then what's like the rank order of things that would be good for inflicting costs or characteristics that would allow me to inflict costs versus generate benefits? And then using those things, try to basically bootstrap your way to an idea of what is the status value of these things. Like if I were to do this act versus this act, how can I get a rank ordering of what skills would be good to cultivate or what events should I seek out or avoid and that kind of stuff. And at least in like, my little cartoonish simulator world, you can kind of do this from some early observations like throughout development. You can get a sense of when people have done this thing, either maybe I get through communications or gossip or whatever between other people, or just from observations of people's emotional reactions, you can maybe assign like that seems like more of a cost than this thing. People didn't like this as much as this thing, that kind of thing. And from there, you can kind of correlate, okay, what's like the value of these things with the status that I see out there in the world. And once you have that kind of correlation, then you can, for a given act that you haven't, maybe you haven't seen the status value of hunting a particular animal or something. You don't know. It's an empty slot in your mind, but you know how much people like that thing or don't like the taste of it or whatever. Then you can use your predictive model that you generated about like the lay of the land in terms of what's the association between value and status or benefit generation and status to like get an estimate of the status impact or the status value of hunting that thing that you haven't hunted before. And if that is a higher status value than maybe alternative things that you could hunt or alternative actions you could take, then that's a pretty good way to kind of figure out what should I do to try and increase my status.
Hmm. It seems like a really important and underappreciated subsidiary problem is knowing what courses of action are even likely to achieve your goals. So, like, maybe I figure out that being a great basketball player is going to get me lots of status.
Mhm.
But whether I am capable of
Yeah,
becoming a good basketball player is itself another problem I need to figure out. Maybe I'm
exactly.
never going to be a good basketball player and it's a waste of time and energy for me to try. Maybe I should
Mhm.
try to do something else instead. So, in addition to computing the value of being a basketball player, I need to estimate my own capability or my own likelihood of actually achieving that goal or how achievable or in control that
Mhm.
thing is.
Yeah.
Maybe the things that give me high status or give people high status are completely out of my control. In which
Mhm.
case, what do I do then? Or maybe it's totally in my control, and I'm I stand a really good chance of being a good basketball player, and I should really invest in this. And so that to me is another interesting problem, and I suspect our the emotion of inspiration might have evolved to solve that problem. That if there's a really high likelihood that investing time and energy into this activity is going to pay off in the long term in terms of my status, I should feel really inspired and energized to invest in that activity. But if there's nothing I can do to become a good basketball player, I should feel the opposite of inspired. I should feel depressed, or I should withdraw from that activity and look for other more inspiring investments. Do you buy that way of thinking?
Yeah, I like that. That's kind of like the direction I was kind of hoping to head next after like trying to lay out some groundwork for how the mind might solve the problem of just like what contributes to status, what are the things an individual in my group or me could do, or if somebody did this thing, how much status are they likely to get? And then from there, figure out, okay, now how do I, as an individual, navigate the status hierarchy? What would be a good thing for me to try to do? Because yeah, obviously there's some things that maybe wouldn't be a good route for you, like you said. Yeah, and I've kind of been thinking, I haven't thought about inspiration per se, but I've one project that has been like languishing for far too long. It is, I've been trying to like work out a distinction between two emotion programs for navigating hierarchies. And I'm not going to say the names of the emotions, because yeah, I just feel like the language, the folk terminology of emotions can get in the way sometimes here. But basically, I think there's one like emotion program that is basically just trying to figure out who has status and coordinates behavior in an appropriate way. Like don't get into unnecessary conflicts with people of higher status or, show deference, whatever. Just by tracking who has status. Like the input is just somebody else's status or a status increasing characteristic that somebody has. It gets activated and you do appropriate behaviors, the rough sketch of it. But there's another one kind of going along with what you're talking about, which is figuring out, okay, like how do I get status? How do I learn the skills and characteristics that will allow me to get status? And there, I think there's another emotion program which tracks other dimensions in addition to like, does this person have status? On top of that, it's also, yeah, like, does this person have status in the domain or in an area that I am trying to get status in? So if I'm an
Hmm.
academic, are they also an academic? And also it's tracking things like, yeah, is this a skill that is, I don't know, cultivatable or practicable or something like that? something that you could work on to improve versus that they're just tall and that get
Yeah.
like, that's not
Right.
something you change. And so there, I think that's like the beginnings of a new kind of set of inputs and a new set of outputs that are designed to maybe try to emulate that person, learn from that person, seek closeness to that person. And I think that's more of like, yeah, a different kind of strategy for cultivating those skills, finding basically like role models or people to emulate. And then just to go another step, because in that realm, if you're just based on those two inputs of, this person maybe is getting status or they have status and they have skill in an area that I'm trying to get status in, basically. Then you could also run into this problem where you don't want to necessarily be emulating competitors, or you don't want to, maybe you can't like buddy up with competitors, or maybe it would be like it would hurt your status to acknowledge that they have status. And in that case, I think then you also need to have this other input being tracked, which is like, is this a competitor? And maybe there's lots of cues to that, like
Mm.
age or, uh, yeah, I don't know. Age is one I'm thinking of right now, but can't think of others. Age, gender, that kind of stuff.
Or
Maybe
just like
would
the
be it.
nature of the thing, right? Where it's sort of like if you're a really good musician and I'm a good musician, but we play different instruments, just a stupid example,
Hmm.
versus we play the same instrument and the
Yeah,
kind
for
of
sure.
music we play is just rival. There's only one lead guitar,
Yeah,
and that's what I want to
yeah,
do and that's what you do.
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, and so I think there's like those three kinds of, I don't know if they need to be entirely separate emotion programs, but I think they lead to different outputs and they track somewhat different inputs, even if they have overlapping inputs. And I think, yeah, the way I've been thinking about it is like they're kind of what folk terminology of like respect versus admiration might be. Like respect is kind of like that baseline one that's just tracking like who has status, did you do something that's status worthy, like, respect, whatever. And then admiration, like who do I emulate? And then maybe envy is more like that other one of like this, you're competing in the same area and you need a different set of outputs in order to solve that problem.
Yeah, I like this. What you're both saying is like this idea of status as a learning problem is super
Hmm.
cool. And David, I love this idea of inspiration. I just looked up like what are inspiring movies, and one of them, the top on the list, is Rudy. And if anybody doesn't know the story of Rudy, it's this kid who's like small, doesn't think he's going to make it on college Notre Dame football, which is the storied, prestigious thing. He just works really, really hard at it. And just by virtue of being the underdog, it's this inspirational story of the underdog by means that are not traditional or were opaque. It doesn't have like he's not strong. Like an underdog story is not like, well, my dad's a senator. I'm, 6'5" and, you know, super muscular and I'm playing on the Notre Dame football. Like that's a terrible movie, but this is like he's a janitor, and he's like, cleaning the stands, but he loves the team and his heart is in it and he wants to be affiliated with the group. And there's no guy like, there's no guile. It's all just sort of, I love the team and he doesn't want his own status. And this is an inspirational story. It suggests that there's a system that always keeps the outcomes there that we might want. Like, I I watch somebody, I learn that being winning a fight is a good thing, but I might be small, and I can't actually do the same thing. Like I can't win the fight like the big guy I just saw. It would be a bad design to dump that as being a good thing, even if I don't think I can do that now, because maybe if I team up with four other small guys, we can still do it, right? So I think like there's this really interesting, complicated compositional structure where there's sort of what are the expected reasonable means, what are the ones that I can probabilistically do? But then there's like some outcomes where it's like unlikely, but there's always interest and attention on if I discover unsurprising means that I didn't see, attend to that. And I think that's what like movies like Rudy or underdog movies in general, I think like why people watch them is because it's providing the input of this is an outcome that people would want, but there's a scenario here of it's surprising given what the preconditions are that this outcome happened.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of like the motivational self-help industry is
Yeah.
about trying to inspire people and making them think that they're more capable of achieving high status than they might have thought. Um,
Yeah.
and it's an interesting question why we're so vulnerable to being misled about the like because a lot of people just really are, probably not going to make it. Like not everyone can be a rock star, not everyone can play
Yeah,
for the
exactly.
NBA. Like, we like to tell people, oh, you can achieve your dreams, but like not everyone can achieve their dreams. That's the sad fact of reality. But we love to hear that we can. Like, why? It seems like we should be skeptical. We should want to know the truth about what our chances are, and pursue activities where we have a good chance, and abandon them when we don't have a good chance. But it seems like we have these kind of we're prone to these kinds of delusions where we think we can be the best, but we actually can. That seems maladaptive. I think it's kind of mysterious. I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's like the Red Bull phenomenon where it's sort of like it even like there's a whole category of advertising, right? Which is sort of like you're a kid and you're like, this is an amazing like mountain biker and he drinks Red Bull. And it's like that has nothing to do, but you're a kid and you're like, this is a high status thing. Like he's an awesome skateboarder, or he's like, or
Yeah.
somebody's a really good singer. What shoes do they wear? Like it doesn't
Hmm.
matter. But the fact that there's leakage of these things, which yeah, is interesting. And I mean, obviously, like I think there's probably, I mean, Patrick, you've probably thought about like this kind of thing. Like, what do you think? Is it like that the world is causally opaque and there's sort of an erring on the side of you don't know if the shoes matter. So
Hmm.
if you can get them, why not?
Yeah, there's a couple things like yeah in those threads. Like one is like yeah, like why are we so do we seem gullible to be like oh yeah I can attain like a lot of status, I can be a big shot and like that. Yeah, I guess I don't know how like culturally widespread that is. So that like, that might be like really just like a one of our quirks in
Mhm.
the like the Western world. I don't know, but
Mhm.
also if it is really like a more culturally widespread thing, then yeah, well, the first thing that comes to mind is like some kind of like if you shoot for the stars, at least you'll land on the moon or whatever kind of thing. Like a little bit of an error management maybe approach, to be like, well, you have to really like be trying for the top to hopefully that you land somewhere else, in order to be motivated. That's like one potential thing. But then even as I'm saying it, I'm like, I could see that backfiring pretty hard.
Yeah.
People are just like, yeah, that person really thinks they're hot shit. Like they're not. And yeah, so I do think that's an interesting problem to try and unpack, and I don't have a good answer for that one right now. Um, but then as far as like that phenomenon of like why the hell can pro athletes or other high status people basically like be used to advertise things that aren't actually like crucial to their
Yeah.
success, most likely, or
Causally
to their
relevant. Like
status.
it's causally
Yeah,
irrelevant. Like, yeah, it's
yeah,
along for the ride. Yeah.
yeah. And that's kind of one of those problems that led me to think a little bit more about like, yeah, like what problem is our mind trying to solve or capable of solving when we're trying to tackle this problem of how do I get status? Because yeah, the world is causally opaque, and this is a pretty wicked like computational problem. Like as a field, right across all science, like figuring out causes is like one of the most difficult problems. Um, and in psychology, we do a pretty crappy job of it. And
It is pretty crazy when you think about it. Like we have, thousands of researchers working over decades
mhm,
trying to figure out this problem of like what is the cause of success. Like that's the holy grail of the social sciences. Like
mhm,
what causes the desirable outcomes that we're all seeking in
mhm,
life. And we've thrown so much time and money and manpower at this problem and we still haven't figured it out. We're still confused as all hell. And yet, in order to survive and reproduce, our minds have to solve this problem. They have to
mhm,
figure out what is the causal process for getting status and resources. Because if the mind didn't figure that out, well, our minds are not going to be descended from the minds that failed to figure that out. We're going to be descended from the minds that figured out that problem. And
well,
so it
yeah.
suggests that our minds might actually be better at this, or our intuitions might actually be better than this, than legions of social scientists with millions of dollars
Mhm,
to spend. Um,
yeah. Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. Like, I think that it's possible that our mind might have evolved to actually get at the causal effects of these things. That's
Yeah.
one thing I'm trying to work out now. It's like the pretty early stages of this project, but trying to see like because in data science, right, there's this distinction between getting at causes, getting at causal effects versus getting a really good predictive model of outcomes. And there oftentimes, or most of the time, those models won't be the same. Like a good causal model that gives you like a good causal effect. What's the effect of buying the shoe on my status? That to get that model, that causal effect estimate correct, your statistical model or your model of the world will be pretty different than just a giant like predictive model of status. And because of in data science, at least like the way statistics work, a good predictive model can have totally biased causal effects. And they would be totally wrong if you were to take them at face value. But it can help you really well predict an outcome that you want to predict.
I see. So, for
And
example, like let's say great white shark attacks are always on the fore of my mind. So, just like
mhm,
if you're like, well, are they selling ice cream that day? And maybe
mhm,
that like correlates really well. So it's really predictive of whether or
mhm,
not, because like, for example, that's like when the sharks are, when it's weather's warm, when weather's warm, people buy ice cream. So
mhm,
like probabilistically, predictively, it's really good to put in the model, but it has no effect causally. Like the person selling ice cream and buying ice cream, there's no
yeah.
causal relation, but it's a good predictor.
Because it could be, especially if you, for some reason, you can't observe how many people there are on the
Right.
beach that day.
Exactly.
And
So that's
then
your
if you can get
best.
any
Yeah,
information
exactly.
about that, then
Right.
that's going to help you get a good predictive model. But then, yeah, like increasing or de artificially decreasing the number of ice cream sales, closing the ice cream shop won't
Right.
change
Yeah.
the number of shark attacks. Like it's not going to have
Exactly.
a
So yeah,
causal
we
effect.
know that when people buy more, when there's a really high number of ice cream cones sold, there's shark attacks. So we should prevent shark attacks by reducing. We should stop people buying ice cream, and
Hmm.
that's silly. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
But like the thing that kind of what I'm trying to get out of this project is to look at like under what circumstances, under what like causal structures of the world will a predictive model be like good enough? Like, because that's what we're really looking for, right? We're looking for like what might be good enough to work for an organism. It might not be the most optimal thing. Like, I agree, the most optimal thing would be like a good causal model or some magical system that figures out the causal structure of the world. And for some problems, that might be totally feasible to do. But for other problems, it might not be feasible to do that. And I kind of this I'm working on some simulations now, which hopefully I'll talk about at HBEST this year, which is kind of showing that at least under some circumstances, which might look similar to how at least I think of the causal structure of status, like a predictive model like could be like pretty decent, could get you pretty far. And if we have like these mechanisms that are kind of just forming predictive models, then you might actually expect that people will just pick up on these erroneous cues and use them. Like what shoes do people wear? What watch do they wear? That kind of stuff that isn't actually causally relevant, but it's just because you have this predictive model, it's going to pick up on those things. And
Mm.
maybe that's like an outcome of the something weird about our world or something that there are all these like extra erroneous cues that actually like aren't part of the causal structure. But yeah, that's another kind of empirical question, I guess.
Mm.
Yeah, can we make it concrete? Just like just so sort of like there's an example. Like let's say
Hmm.
this problem of learning. I'm a kid and I see somebody fishing,
Hmm.
and they get a lot of fish,
Hmm.
a lot more than I've ever seen before, and everyone's really happy about that.
Hmm.
So that's like the event,
Hmm.
and there's lots of things, lots of ways to carve that event up. And
Yeah.
is the idea sort of what you're saying that there might be privileged categories? So like the lesson I could draw from that is like providing people with a lot of fish is a good thing, or providing people with a lot of resources is a good thing, or things that are hard to catch that people like is a good thing. That's one issue. Another issue is like, well, how do they catch a lot of fish? Like, I could try to fish there another day when they're not there. I might look at all the things they're using, like the physical accoutrements, and then say, copy what they do. And maybe that's where like the sneakers and the watch kind of parasitize on because we're sort of like, I don't know why they caught a lot of fish. If I did, I wouldn't catch a lot of fish myself. So I don't know. So maybe I should just emulate everything. So I'm going to wear the same, so like I'm going to wear the same shirt color, even though I don't know if that's relevant. So I'm going to over
Hmm.
imitate in a way. So is the idea that there's these sort of pre-privileged structures that are part of the predictive model? Is that sort of what you're saying in the context of this sort of fishing example?
Yeah, like for the fishing example, right? Like I'm just gonna imagine there's like it's cold weather that day, and I don't know if this is true about fish, but let's say when it's cold, like the fish are more active, they're like
Right.
near the surface or something, they're hungrier or whatever. And when it's cold, people are more like want to wear a jacket or wear some fur or something, you know? And so you have this confound of weather that's leading to this new cue of like, what is this fisher who's going to catch more fish than usual? Like, oh, he's wearing something different than typical, or well, you know, whatever, and he catches more fish. And so you have the confound there, the weather. So you don't, if you don't have a pre-built system that like kind of removes or holds constant weather in figuring this stuff out, or controls for it, basically, like you won't be able to, you might miss apply the correlation between like the sweater wearing and the fish as a causal effect, thinking that you can wear a sweater and that's gonna let you get more fish, right?
Right.
Um, yeah, and
This is
then
Hume's problem of induction, right? Like every time that you see, and this is like famously like philosophically like in language learning, that any one instance, there's an infinite number of things you could sort of learn from that instance.
mhm,
Like the person was successful because it was a Tuesday. The person was successful because they were wearing a fur coat. The person was successful because it was a Tuesday and they were wearing a fur coat. Like all kinds of
mhm,
crazy stuff. And what you're saying is without some built-in ways of narrowing that down in this context of learning about status, or maybe status inter 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 um, interpenetrated with like event cognition, so sort of like what leads to catching fish, or what are the things that plausibly might do that. Without that, you're really out of luck.
yeah, and that, obviously that's like a whole another like research area that people I'm sure are looking into, and like on the top, but the status problem is that there's like hundreds of things that people are doing, and even figuring out like, you know, which of those things actually change their status is another like a level of that problem. And so, yeah, again, this is like I'm really early in trying to even like define like this problem in like little statistical models. So I don't know how much more I can really say about it, but it seems like there will be some problems that are intractable. Like you can't solve them as an organism with your experiences. Especially if you can't do the interventions yourself because they're too costly or they're too inefficient. Like you would have to do, you know, hundreds of these interventions yourself to really know the causal effect or whatever. And in that case, like the better than nothing system to evolve might be just a prediction model that makes some mistakes, but it's right often enough in getting the relative, like it might be wrong for every actual causal effect, but about figuring out the relative, which things tend to be better than other things out of 100 things, it could be useful for getting like a rough estimate of that and
So
helping you rank order that in your head.
I think considerable insight can be made here by dividing this into two different problems that are intimately related. So the first problem is just how do I get status? How do I intervene on the world to get status? And with that, prediction is not enough. I need causality. I need to know what causal processes are going to increase my status.
Mhm.
But there is a second problem that I think is too often overlooked and is extremely important, and that is a coordination problem. And that is, how do I reach agreement with my community about who is high status and who is low status?
Hmm.
And for that problem, I don't necessarily need to know the causal structure of the
Mhm.
world to solve that problem. I just need to know how to predict who people are going to listen to and pay attention to, who people are going to side with, and who they're not going to side with. And for that, correlation is enough. If people
Mhm.
who wear fancy suits and use big words are high status, it doesn't matter if the fancy suits or the big words cause the high status, as long as everyone thinks that everyone else thinks that those are high status traits. then it benefits me to go along with the group in assuming that these are high status things.
Hmm.
And as soon as you have that coordination that we've all coordinated on, the people who use big words, the people who wear fancy clothes, these people are high status. Well, all of a sudden, I can take advantage of that by imitating those high status words, by wearing the fancy clothes, and tricking other people into thinking that I'm high status because they've already coordinated on the fact that that thing is high status,
Hmm.
right? And so it may be not merely that the causal problem is too hard to solve, and therefore we just settle for the correlates. It may be that the correlates in some cases are enough
Yeah,
because of
for
this
sure.
important aspect of coordination
Hmm.
that is at the heart of it. And
Yeah.
and when coordination enters the picture, you can have a self-fulfilling process where people are high status for being high status, where they
Hmm.
don't actually have any special ability to generate benefits, but because everyone thinks that everyone else thinks that they have those abilities, they have high status. And in cases like that, the status bubble can burst once we all gain common knowledge that the person isn't all they're cracked up to be. And so I think it's another aspect where coordination, common knowledge is really overlooked and important part of the process here
Yeah.
with status.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that extension. Like I have been thinking about it as yeah, there are like these purely predictive problems or could be purely predictive problems, which is just like, oh, of my peer group, without knowing anything about causal structure of status, can I predict who's going to be higher status in the future? Like that's just a good predictive model to have. And so there, yeah, but then also the causal structure stuff, which is like, what can I do? How do I intervene on the world to get status? But I hadn't thought too much about this, like the self-fulfilling prophecy on top of the predictive models then becomes part of the causal structure of the world, actually. And I like that. I like that take. Yeah, and then of course you're kind of like the coordination games that we play when we're competing for status. They change a lot and they fall apart when it becomes common knowledge that we are competing for status. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, I'll definitely have to think. Yeah, what happens at like I guess that's like the second order effects of having these prediction models working and trying to predict what other people think about the hierarchy and stuff like that. I like that.
Yeah, in homage to Catalonia, George Orwell, it's his story about joining Franco fighting against the fascists in Spain in 1930s, and he's with the anarchists and the. But he talks about when he goes to Spain in the beginning, because it's sort of like a class-based revolution. uh, he was wearing like a suit and a tie and a collar, and he's on the train to Spain, and everyone's like, "You can't wear that. Like you're going to be like ostracized." And so like he quickly picks up on like that the local ecology is like the more working class you look, the higher status you're granted. And then months later, when he's actually like fleeing Spain after the he like fights in the war and sort of the class-based revolution didn't pan out, it flips again. And now he actually escapes and isn't even questioned on the train out of Spain by sort of dressing up and looking kind of bougie. And so, like, that was an example of it's exactly this thing of what counts as given status completely flipped. And he was able to sort of, from the local ecology, pick that up, and it flipped like within the course of a year or something like that.
Yeah. In my example that I often think of with this is at least from my memory of the COVID-19 like early days pandemic, which could be flawed, and this isn't like a value judgment or anything, but I just remember early on the narrative was, uh, N95 masks were scarce, and so we should be saving those for healthcare workers. And so yeah, I think like implicitly maybe I was like if I saw somebody wearing an N95 mask, maybe I might have thought they were a little selfish or something like that.
Mm.
But then later on, as I don't know, supply chains or whatever caught up with those demands, it became like people should be wearing an N95 mask, and they're totally flipped. Then if you're not wearing one, I'm like, what are you doing? Don't you know like those cloth masks? Maybe they don't do, maybe they don't do like anything at all. I don't know, whatever I thought at the time. But yeah, you can see those kinds of dynamics changing all the time. The value of the same action changes, not just in our lifetimes, but yeah, over weeks or months or yeah. And
Yeah.
it's yeah.
Yeah. this is awesome, and I can imagine too. Like, it's a weird question. Again, it's instinct blindness. We're sort of like obviously like high status. That's obvious. Like, why would we even need to study that? And I think it's really to your credit, but I imagine it's difficult. And I don't know what the reception of this work has been outside of an evolutionary approach, but like one of the things taking an evolutionary approach or a cognitive science approach gives you is this out kicking you out of your instinct blindness. But this really strikes me as like something that hasn't been studied outside of like a very narrow set of people. Status, like I don't know, there's not a cognitive science of status, is there?
Yeah, it's big in social psychology for sure. Especially looking at more like surface level things of like, yeah, what personality characteristics are associated with status. And but it's not so much, at least in my view, it's not so much of like how does status work at a deep like kind of
Right.
computational level. How do we, given that this navigating status hierarchies is probably like a fundamental problem that our ancestors had to solve, like how do you solve this? Because it's not like every other adaptive problem. It's not like the problem of finding mates. I don't think it's different. So you need different machinery to solve that, even if
Yeah.
it helps you find mates and stuff like that, right?
Right. And to also just clarify, like you're not thinking about this from the perspective of status seeking the way we usually think about it in a folk way, which is I think like a lot of people are like, oh, there's somebody who's just trying to seek status. They're not actually like interested in like their
Hmm.
job or like their mate or they're
Yeah.
not serious. They're
Hmm.
really in it for the status. And I mean, I think that is a real evolved entry, but I think
Hmm.
you're talking about just no below the surface, there's just evolved software for you look out and you're like, okay, I gotta eat, I gotta have like social support. How can I not be an asshole? What do people like and what can I do so that I have support and that people don't think I'm an asshole? So I think like a lot of bad things get thrown under the rubric of like status seeking, but I imagine a lot of good
Hmm.
things, like as just kids learn up of like when you're mean, other kids don't want to play with you. Like that's part of figuring out like what to invest in for
Yeah.
status. And I don't think it often gets framed that way. Is that consistent with how you're thinking about it? Like
Yeah.
that
I've
caveat that it's not the folk category status
mhm.
seeking?
Yeah, if in fact I think I've in my head at least like implicitly, maybe not explicitly, like pretty much framed it as just like you're just trying not to lose status. You're not trying to go down. Like many people might not really care that much about going up and up and up and up, like becoming like the, top of the hierarchy or whatever. But I would wager that like nobody is like, yeah, like I want to go down in status. Like
Hmm.
nobody. And so I think that's really what it's more about. It's about like avoiding the problems of that come with, yeah, losing social support, like ostracism and yeah, and
Defensive
and the
status, as
conflict
David
and
talked
about
about.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
mediating these kind of conflicts. I mean, that's one of the hypotheses from the animal literature about like what are hierarchies for, if hierarchies have a function, what is it? And it's to maybe stabilize like intergroup conflict over resources. And so if
Mhm.
you're pushing, I don't think many people are just going to keep pushing and pushing. Like, I think this is probably well calibrated to kind of figure out like what seems reasonable and just you don't want to be losing status because that's where, you'll get a lot of costs, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think the folk concept of status, I think, ties much more to the offensive version of status or the being superior to others, rather than the avoidance of being inferior. And I think that's why we often see status seekers as assholes, is because it's much more of a threat to me if you're trying to be better than me, if you're trying to outdo me. Because if you're trying to outdo me, then my status is going to fall as a result of your pursuit. But if you're just trying to avoid looking worse than me, you're just trying to avoid getting ostracized or ganged up on, that's much less of a threat to me, and it's more understandable and sympathetic. And so the problem is that our folk concept of status is mainly framed in terms of superiority. And that's why we often lose status for overtly seeking status, is because people interpret it as a threat to them, and they interpret it as a kind of selfishness. Because if I'm trying to be better than you or to others, then that benefits me and it hurts others, and the benefit to me is smaller than the cost to others, and so that gets framed as a kind of selfishness. And that, unfortunately, because you can lose status for overtly seeking status, that creates a kind of volatility where if we all gain common knowledge that we're all just trying to be better than each other, then we all look worse than each other, and we have to do something else to gain status. Or at least I've written a lot about that, and I think that
Hmm.
might underlie a lot of the arbitrariness and volatility of our status symbols. And I can get status for these weird random things like powdered wigs or wearing a certain type of clothing, baggy clothing versus tight fitting clothing. Um,
What's weird
you
about
can
powdered wigs, David?
Well, it's interesting. I was reading
Kidding,
about this, and
kidding.
it is. I find powder wigs so funny. It's. I mean, I think the fact that we find them funny is like it's the remnants of that status game collapsing. I think
Yeah, no,
status games
totally. Yeah.
collapse once we realize that they're just funny, that they're just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Historians have written about this with dueling. Like dueling used to be taken very seriously, but now we just find it funny. Like it's just kind of hilarious. The Looney Tunes like engage in dueling.
Yeah.
It's just a macho pissing contest. It's like this stupid thing.
Yeah.
But like at the time, people took it very seriously, and if you were to laugh at it, that would be a huge, hugely taboo. And so I think these status games collapse when we all just realize that they're ridiculous pissing contests. And probably many of our current status games are likely to collapse at some point in the future when we realize that they're ridiculous pissing contests. And predicting which status games are likely to be stable and persist into the future versus which ones are likely to collapse, I think that is also part of the adaptive problem of inspiration. It's not merely, what kinds of status are likely to pay off or are worth investing in. It's also like, is this status game going to be stable into the future, or is it going to turn into a laughing stock next
Hmm.
year or in 5 years? Right? It's going to suck if I try to invest in being good at dueling if dueling is just going to be funny and stupid next year, right? And so I think another part of inspiration is the status game around something that isn't framed as status. Like, is it the pursuit of something higher and noble or altruistic? And that is a cue that it's going to be stable into the future. And so I think what inspires us is a person who invests a lot of time and energy into a status game without caring about status and then gets showered with status, right? That's really inspiring
Hmm.
because it suggests that, yeah,
Yeah, or
like,
shows us like how to do it. Or like it's like
yeah,
you can
exactly.
do it too. Or like you see a avenue of like, a great teacher, a book inspired me. And
Yeah,
your claim is the readout. That's the readout of I see a path towards doing this thing that has these positive attributes.
right. Exactly. Um, so yeah, no, I've been just thinking about this stuff a lot
Yeah.
lately. And I think inspiration is a really interesting topic that's underappreciated
Yeah, I
in
like that.
evolutionary science.
Yeah,
Yeah.
especially if it like as in a way of separating it from maybe admiration and envy and respect, even though it's maybe a hierarchy navigating emotion. Like, yeah, the outputs might not involve emulating people. They're just like a motivation to do a particular thing.
Yeah.
Or yeah, yeah.
Yeah, a teacher inspired me, a book inspired me. I like that. Like that explains that it's all I like this what you're both saying is, and again, it's very counter instinct blindness where it's the deep structure of is this a way to make a living in the world, sort of, and I think like
Hmm.
people recognize that at some level. Like you kind of have to be like, I want to do something that excites me, that inspires me. And I think what people mean by that is they detect a possibility of doing well and being able to do well such that there will be rewards greater than the default expected rewards, right? Like it's sort of this thing of
Yeah.
like, oh, I discovered something that I might be better at than most people or that I thought, and then I might get more out of than most people or that I thought,
Hmm.
if you really reduce it down.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I think
'Cause
another cue to, this status game being worth investing in, and being stable over the long run is, has it been stable in centuries past? Have my
mm,
ancestors been playing this status game for generations? If
mhm,
so, that's a really good one to invest in because, if it's lasted for generations, then it's not going to become a laughing stock next year, right?
mhm,
And so that should be inspiring. If I'm doing the same thing that, my ancestors have done for generation after generation, you know, um, uh, it still gets to me. I was watching Moana with my daughter, and there's this scene where Moana discovers that her ancestors were explorers for generations, and the whole movie they were telling her that she shouldn't go out and explore because it's too dangerous. And then she realized that the things that she really wants to do, like her ancestors have been doing it for generations. It was really beautiful. Like it moves me when I see that.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think another part of it, is doing something that has been done for many generations into the past. Anyway, I'm
Yeah.
just going off on my thinking on this topic, but I'm
Yeah, I
curious
like
if you
that,
have.
especially as like a storytelling, cultural storytelling as a kind of way of, teaching or helping our status navigation systems learn what are good status games that are worth
Hmm.
coordinating around. Because I mean, and there might even be, yeah, some cultural evolution to that too, where you're like, yeah, like we don't want our next generations coordinating over stupid status games that lead to conflict or harm our culture or our group. And so kind of like, I don't know, inoculating them or yeah, trying to get that implanted in them early on, kind of like with storytelling about what your ancestors have done could be like one of those kind of cultural technologies to help prevent some of these like pointless status games and or try to push them towards ones that like seem to have been beneficial generation after generation kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, no one gets inspired about wearing baggy pants because those are going to go out of style in a few
Mhm.
years anyway. But people might get inspired about like wearing the religious garb of their ancestors that their ancestors have been wearing for generations. Um,
I mean, there is on the baggy pants thing, right? Like,
yeah,
this is going to be embarrassing to admit, but like, I think, as somebody, I grew up wearing like really tight skinny jeans, right?
yeah,
And I used to put on like baggy pants or whatever. Like I got bought a pair of pants from somebody by somebody else or whatever, and I'd be like, the aesthetics of these are like I hated them. They were
yeah,
all wrong and stuff. And
yeah,
since that trend has changed, like the aesthetic sensibility that I have has changed, and
yeah.
I like the baggy silhouette now. Something
Hmm.
that I would have felt totally uncomfortable in before. So yeah, like even knowing that it will change, I was still
Yeah,
inspired by that. You could view that as inspired by that new aesthetic to enjoy it.
yeah.
And embarrassingly, like I got some wide pants on. Like, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing to like look at the silly things that people used to wear in previous generations. I know sometimes like when I look at pictures of people wearing bell bottoms in the 70s, like they're so ridiculous. Like I can't believe people thought that was cool and yet people did. I'm sure at the time like it
Yeah.
felt like really cool, but now it's not cool. Um yeah, our sense of aesthetics is so interestingly blended with status and hard to tease apart from
Yeah.
Yeah.
status.
Yeah, I feel like you all talked about this maybe on like another episode. Yeah, and I feel like if I'm remembering your kind of intuition of the explanation, right? I think I liked it. It's like in a sense, like keeping up with these like changing aesthetics
Oh
is
yeah, it was
itself a
David. It was
skill.
David's wife saying that
Yeah.
you've
It
lost
is
your fashion.
yeah, it is kind of like
Sorry, David.
a skill
No worries.
like and it's maybe showing like that you're I don't know, still trying to impress somebody or you're just trying to be relevant. I'm not saying this is necessarily the thing that you should be striving for, but
Yeah.
it is communicating maybe something if you're still trying to keep up with some trends, even if they are
It signals
things
that
that will
you're,
collapse
yeah,
soon.
that
Yeah.
you're socially savvy enough to be aware of the trends
Hmm.
Yeah.
because they're often pretty subtle and hard to, notice and pick up on. And if you can pick up on those trends, then you're going to be pretty socially competent and picking up on other subtle cues and avoiding embarrassing yourself. Like that's a good skill to have. I think it's a kind of social coordination ability.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's another dimension of status.
Yeah, and I think a
Uh,
lot of stuff is explained by understanding this issue that it's about the audience and that there may not be a uniform audience. So, like kids are signaling and negotiating status with themselves at some level. So, like the old man, like these kids in their baggy pants, it's like, and the kids don't care. The kids are doing stuff to piss off the older adults, or or the older adults just like it's not part of their status game. And so I think the idea that this is all about status is with respect to an audience, and that audience may or may not be as many people as possible, right?
Hmm.
This also comes back to this definition because the definition is like sort of how do others listen to you or defer to you, And there's two paths to do that. One is everybody, but another one is you really commit to like a narrow subset, right? So you can imagine sort of like I'm generally like well respected, like take it back to Patton and like Kanamba, like in the village, and everybody listens to me. Or maybe like, I'm just really like I'm a very partisan person and like the this particular group, like half of them hate me, but the other half really like me. Those are two different ways of having status. One averages out to zero, but still might be pursued, And I think like have you thought about that too? Like how status it's not maybe universal in the sense of who the audience is for either.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of also in line with what you're saying, but yeah, like as far as, we're talking about like value to some number of other people, and ultimately those other people, the people who you're trying to be valuable to or to have them have a high welfare trade-off ratio so that they'll back you in a conflict, like that group, well, I think only needs to be as big as or the right people to be stronger than the opposing coalition. And in some cases, probably in a lot of cases for like at least ancestral contexts of human groups, like you probably just want the most people. But especially in, I don't know, our world, if there's one group of people that has a lot of guns and the other group of people, and if the rest of the people don't really have a lot of guns, you can pretty easily have more resource holding potential by just trying to get those people who have a lot of guns to really like you and want to defend you, even if there are way more people in the other group, right?
Mm.
So I think there probably is some of this, like you can, or like more simply, right? If there's like a few warriors and a bunch of people who are not warriors, they don't fight, then like monopolizing the warrior group can get you status, even if as a whole the rest of the group doesn't value you and wouldn't come to your aid in a conflict. As long as you at the group, the inter like yeah, your little coalitional level,
Mm.
you have more power, then I think that can be a stable way of getting status by, dominating another group. But really the way you're getting these group of people to come to your aid is probably through benefit generation,
Yeah.
for them, for the stronger coalition.
Yeah.
And
It's
that's where I think
interesting.
like
Yeah.
defining groups, which is something that like obviously, you're working on. For me, like I got to kind of that point and I was like, I don't know what a group is.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to define like, yeah, these things. And I think that's we need a definition of how do we carve up these different groups? How do we know like who is our coalition versus these
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
coalitions?
Yeah. And yeah, I think it's an inference within that software. Like I don't think it's like a thing out in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, let me add another layer of complication to this already hugely complicated mess, where, it's hard enough to figure out what the status landscape is now. And that's an important part of the adaptive problem. But another hugely important part of the adaptive problem is forecasting what the status landscape is likely going to be in the future. So it may be that the people with the guns have all the status, or at least they have all the power now because they have guns and we don't. But if I can forecast that that situation is actually precarious because those people with guns are actually resented by everyone in the community, and they're viewed as predatory and selfish, and there's an uprising of people, and though they're small now, they seem to have morality on their side, and morality is itself a kind of focal point for coordination. And so it might be better off for me teaming up with the band of rebels who right now are weaker and right now have lower status. But because they have the moral high ground, I can forecast that the status landscape is going to change if I team up with these people who have the moral high ground. And so that adds another aspect of this of choosing the status game that has more moral gravity. Because that is a good sign that that status game is going to grow and be more stable into the future than ones that are more fragile, are more selfish seeming, are more likely to collapse, um, etc. Of course,
Yeah.
so now you got to throw morality into the whole picture,
Yeah.
which is its all, a
All
whole
too
other
real.
complicated mess. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
What
and some
sucks is that
people I
it's
think
like
even
status is
treat
just connected to
morality.
literally every issue
Yeah.
It, rem- it
in the evolutionary social sciences.
it
Hmm.
reminds me again, this is the to be quote of like everything, the canonical example of evolutionary psychology is high school social dynamics, which is, it's also this thing of like the trope of like the high schooler who peaks during high school, where you're sort of like, well, what genre of kid am I going to be? Am I going to be like a nerd, a theater kid, a music kid, a jock, or, popular, or, and, you can imagine at some level there's machinery for sort of being like, what are my proclivities, but then like what's future proofing this? And the kind of trope of, oh man, high school is like the best thing, and then the person whose life is sort of terrible and low status after high school, it's sort of we sort of laugh about that, but I think it's the readout of the system of like, oh, they kind of either were a victim or judged incorrectly about how future proof the status game was. They thought like, being the captain of the football team and being kind of a bully and like, dating the pretty girl was the way to get status, and that worked. But then like the nerd who didn't have a lot of status and maybe got picked on in high school was like, well, I'm really smart and like I'm gonna be fine once high school's over, and like has a really good job and has a good life and like has high status, quote unquote, according to other metrics. I think seeing that as a trope, I think is a readout of this sort of like issue you're talking about, David, which is sort of like you can be wrong about which status game you sort of tie your fortunes to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think this ties in a lot to moral progress as well, because a lot of moral discourse is about in the next generation our forebears are going to look back at us and see that we were barbaric for say eating
Mm,
factory farmed meat or something like that. And a big part of the moral discourse game is finding issues that our forebears are going to look back at us and condemn. And if we can find that now, then that's a forecast of the future status landscape, and that
mm,
is a good investment to invest in now. So if I see that this eating factory farm meat business, this isn't looking good. This status game is gonna collapse pretty soon, and the vegans are gonna end up looking morally superior to everyone else. So I better get in on this veganism business now, and I'm making kind of a moral status game forecast for the future, and I think that might be part of this as well. But before we get too wishy-washy into abstract theoretical stuff, I want to anchor us into empirical stuff, which you've done a lot of really cool empirical stuff, Patrick. Um, so you've done work on how good people are at figuring out what is going to get them status and what isn't. So could you talk about your work on that question and how good are people at figuring this stuff out?
Yeah, I was just gonna say this sounds like a good segue into like the personality stuff. Now we're talking
yeah.
about, yeah, like all these differences and how well people are predicting future status games versus, yeah, predicting all these things about status, right? Yeah, that's basically like, so after doing, or not after, but while doing this status kind of stuff, trying to learn more about like how do these mechanisms work at like a species typical level. Yeah, I kind of got sucked into like thinking about the individual differences in these things because there's so many spaces for these individual differences to creep in. Like, we've hinted at a whole bunch of different little systems in the mind that all are designed to like pick up on certain inputs and produce certain outputs or estimate different things. And any like differences there in any of those systems that creep in for whatever reason, either due to differences in developmental calibration or genetic noise or, you know, facultative calibration, whatever, like they can produce differences in behavior. Like that's kind of the whole thing that we're talking about is like, are you going to pursue becoming a football player or an academic? Like somewhere your mind uh, estimated one to be a better strategy than the other, maybe, and maybe that was incorrect or something, but it led to differences in behavior, a choice that then will lead to other aspects of your everyday behaviors changing too, and the way you think and feel will be changing too over time. And so, really, like, I think these kinds of things, obviously not just hierarchy navigation mechanisms, all the psychological mechanisms in our head and individual differences therein, like, are the true personality generators, so to speak. Like, these are the things that produce differences in behavior that over time accumulate into these, tendencies or dispositions average differences in thoughts, feelings, and behavior, which is like what personality is according to personality psychologists. And and yeah, so I started to just think about like how does differences in our ability to estimate the status impacts of different things, like how might that play into personality? And this is kind of like a first pass of trying to figure out like, can I measure these things? Can I measure differences in this like accuracy of the system? What would that look like? And then can I tie those parameters to broader traits like motivations, um, and hexaco traits is kind of where I was at there. And I didn't make really big predictions beforehand, in part just because I view this work kind of as exploratory. Like, I think the theory is there in the thinking that there are psychological mechanisms that pay attention to these inputs and these outputs and individual differences in how people map these inputs to outputs will lead to behavioral differences. And sometimes those behavioral differences might be obvious, but I think there's going to be a lot of like non-intuitive ways in which our personality terminology, like the words that we use to describe people, which is what like our personality scales are ultimately tapping into, um, they're going to map onto those things in non-obvious ways. So that's kind of why I view this as exploratory, even though I think it's fundamentally rooted in theory. Um, and yeah, basically, like what we found is people who are better at, or at least have a closer assessment of the impacts, status impacts to what other people say, tend to be themselves like more motivated to get status. They're more status driven. And of course, you can imagine different like causal structures at play here. Like it could be somewhere in your head, there's a motivational, yeah, there's a motivation somehow representing how much you pay attention to status information. And because you pay attention to more status information, that leads to more accurate estimates. And then that's why they're correlated. Or it could be maybe there's some other reasons why some people's status impact assessment systems or whatever are more accurate. And then as you're going through life, you're getting feedback. Like if you have a really accurate one, you're probably going to be rewarded more often with status. And so it kind of feeds this motivation
Mm,
for status. Versus if you're
mm,
inaccurate a lot of times, maybe you don't get that feedback. And so you actually learn that maybe status seeking is not a good strategy for me. So you kind of don't have that motivation as strong.
mm.
So, and it could be both or, whatever. But I think there's multiple causal pathways that could lead to that. Um, yeah. And
How do you,
then,
oh,
yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead. I was just going to ask a clarifying question. How did you measure
Oh,
accuracy of assessment?
yeah. So basically, we have like these lists of acts, characteristics, and events, like 240 whatever things that you could do or somebody else could do. And in this research, we're basically asking like a large group of people if somebody did this thing, would this increase or decrease their status in your eyes? Or sometimes it's in the eyes of others in your community, whatever the exact prompt is. So we use that, or I use that as like the kind of criterion. So that's like as close to the ground truth as I think I'm going to get. And there's all kinds of issues with that, of course. But it's a way of estimating kind of the ground truth. What's the average status impact across different groups, let's say. And then I ask another group of people who are like the main subjects. They go in and I give them the same things. And I say, like, if you did this thing or it happened to you, like, what do you think would happen to your status? And then you can basically like, in a sense, get a, a sense of like, what is the difference between the criterion and each person's estimate? And you can get a couple of different parameters. Like one is, do they tend to overestimate how beneficial things are? Do they tend to underestimate how beneficial things are? That's one parameter, kind of like, yeah, a continuum. And then another parameter is like, do they have the rank ordering right? Like how well correlated is their estimate of the world with the objective criterion? And so with those two, you can kind of treat them as different parameters that index like the accuracy of the system, or that's how I've been treating these parameters anyway. So you could be like have a really good rank ordering of things, a good correlation between what you think and what most people think, but you just tend to think that things tend to be better than average, or you could tend to think that they're worse, or you could have just like almost like messed up rank ordering of what things are better. You think this is like, being good at basketball is better than being good at uh, something else. I have no examples, but
Yeah.
yeah, it could be totally flipped or whatever. And so basically, I find that people who are have a better like rank ordering, a more true rank ordering, or a rank ordering that corresponds more to other like the average rank ordering of people tend to have higher motivations for status. And
And
they also tend to think that things are better for status than they are.
so they
Um,
overestimate the status benefits of
yeah.
acts.
But it's still,
Interesting.
but the relative rank ordering about like which things are better than
Right.
other things, they're still good at.
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
it's like, in a way, it's like they're not inaccurate. They just kind of think like everything just seems better to them, you know?
Hmm. Interesting.
Um,
And how are you measuring status motivations?
that one's just like the standard kind of, I used a couple different self-report scales. Like there's a Kenrick has one in the fundamental motives. And then there's another one, I forget the author, but they're like the standard kind of like self-report personality type motivation questions.
Interesting. Because if if I recall, it seems I think that status motivation, depending on how you measure it, is correlated with like dark triad traits like
Hmm.
narcissism, manipulativeness,
Hmm.
psychopathy. Is that correct?
It probably depends on how you measure it. I don't remember off the
Yeah.
top of my head what the correlate, because I do have like honesty, humility in this study.
Yeah.
I don't remember exactly what the correlation was, but yeah, it probably depends on exactly the wording of like what goes into those status motivation questionnaires. Is it like I want to be
Yeah.
better than other people, I want to be superior, I like to be in charge, or is
Right.
it like I want others to value me and like,
Right.
that kind of stuff.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
because yeah, like I do have the honesty humility scale, and that was another finding from that basically that study is that people who are low on honest humility, meaning like people who probably that would correlate with the dark triad. If you're low on honest humility, you'd be
Yeah.
higher on dark triad traits because they're like, super highly correlated. They actually tended to be like less accurate in the rank ordering of things. So they tended to
Mm,
think that things mattered more for status than they actually did, but they were less accurate about, what those things were exactly. So,
mm,
you know, the story that I can kind of think about in my head or my way of interpreting this is like, your motive you think things are better for status than they are, and the things that you think are better for status are actually not better than some other things. So maybe things like trying to be assertive or uh, trying to be trying to always get your way or show that you're better than other people. Like you might think that those are good, but most people think that they're not good. And so you do behaviors that other people interpret as being like Machiavellian or, you know, uh, not humble, and that filters into your story of what your personality is,
mm.
basically.
So it suggests that assholes might be just bad at status seeking. They might not realize that being an asshole is low status.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that might be some of what's going on here, and we have another study not looking at status things, but I think some yeah, assholes, people that either other people think of assholes and then might think of themselves as assholes because other people think of them as assholes, like they might just be less accurate at estimating these important social things uh, that go factor into these decisions and behaviors and things people say, and that influences that how much people think they're an asshole, you know? Uh,
To defend assholes, which I don't want to do, but just from a purely scientific perspective, it's sort of, I think there could be an argument that it's sort of similar to like being a criminal, which is sort of if you ask people like, would it be good to like rob somebody? Everyone would be like, that's terrible. Don't do it. But
hmm
the problem is you get the benefit from doing it to one person, you know?
hmm
So like it might be a thing of somebody is like I think a thing very common is women who sort of seem vulnerable and like some asshole dude is like really manipulative or controlling of her. Most people would say that that's a bad thing, but the benefits that guy's getting are sort of flowing through her and is he's sort of protecting himself from like the rest of the social world. So in other words, like he's a strategy getting a benefit from one particular person, even though most people would argue what he's doing is wrong. And that's where like the crime metaphor comes in, where it's sort of like the costs aren't always what everybody thinks. It might just be you're this asshole still getting a benefit because the way that they can exploit a small subset of the population.
Hmm. Or like in their group, like their group of people, their peers, like the status game they're playing
Right.
is actually that like maybe it is like you need to control, your spouse or whatever, or it is that
Yeah,
you need
you're
to
just you're
steal
in
things to
the
be cool,
yeah,
that's how
you're
you get
in some
status.
sort of I don't know what are these pickup artists, or like that's your status community, right? And
Hmm.
so you're just that's what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's where I think like the way I've empirically tried to do this anyway breaks down because really I think we need to be at the level of like individual groups
Right.
and the people in those groups and
Right.
define the status criteria within those groups because a lot of what my work might be capturing is just deviations from like the average, whatever the average group is. So it's kind of not the exact comparison I want to be making, but just
Mm, yeah.
trying to delineate like what do I model this? Because that's kind of where I'm trying to see my work or where I see my work heading is with individual differences, trying to like model the actual parameters within these psychological mechanisms and you like getting an estimate, for example, of like how well is your situation detector for devaluation functioning? And then, what is your set point for devalue? What's your threshold for how much you'll tolerate being devaluated? And then like what behaviors do you view as being having high utility for solving the problem of being devaluated? Like all of that within the shame system, those could be different parameters. And I want to be able to measure those parameters somehow and then link them to these traditional lexical concepts in personality to try and give us an explanatory account of what these lexical descriptive dimensions are, like the big five and the hexaco.
So personality, because we're starting in on this, but I want to just
Hmm.
make sure it's clear for everybody. So one idea is that in a world where there are no differences between people, there's sort of just state dependent paths where you just happen to be exposed to comic books and David gets exposed to jokes and I get exposed to bike riding and we just start down the path of maybe this is a status game we'd like to pursue. And the mystery of personality is why are there stable differences or correlated differences among
Hmm.
individuals? And I guess the idea is that at some level that's driven by a commitment to a particular strategy and an assessment of the cost of switching. So, for example, if you're down the path of comic books or bicycles or telling jokes, every moment you spend investing in that, there's more of a switch cost and an opportunity cost to switch to the next thing all equal. So even on a world where there's no differences or proclivities, just by simply being exposed to like one kind of status game versus another, you might get just by virtue of this evolved design of calculating what are the switch costs, you might start to get stable differences. But then in addition to that, and what I just said is oversimplified, you get this extra thing of there's an assessment of is this body envelope good at riding bikes versus telling jokes versus comic books? I mean, it's a dumb example, but you get the idea.
Hmm.
And then that kind of somehow you sort of feel out how am I doing if I invest 5 units of effort in each three of these things?
Hmm.
How many cues of success or status do I get? And maybe that also affects things. So is that the way you're thinking about it? Is that really what personality is, or the stable differences between people? And we haven't talked about like the personality types yet, because we can talk
Hmm.
about that in a second. But is this the idea that there's sort of an underlying sort of contingency rules in human beings, and that leads them to invest in certain activities or have certain
Yeah.
goals? And that is, in a weird way, that's part of personality. Is that the claim?
Yeah, I think that's part of the claim anyway. But really, like I think the claim that I'm making, and I think that like people that I've worked with on this also would agree with this, is like, any psychological system that we're talking about, whether it's shame or the status impact estimation system or your plant learning systems, um, all of these things, if we think about them like bits of code, they have more or less maybe some separable pieces. So like I've been thinking a lot about emotions for this because I like how there's these different pieces. And in particular, I like this like cybernetic view, which is slightly different from like the typical view, but or the way we frame things typically in the evolutionary psychological sciences. But I don't think it's at odds. I think it's just like maybe a helpful analogy for this example. So like imagine just a thermostat, right? So a thermostat in a house, it has a few different components to it that allows it to do its job. Like one of those components is like basically a temperature detector, like a thermometer or whatever. And that allows it to detect the ambient temperature. And then there's also a set point, which is like the internal setting of like what the temperature should be set by the user or whatever. And basically the job of this comparator is to using the ambient temperature index to determine is that above or below it, right? And then depending on whether it's above or below it, it will turn on like the air conditioning. It will do some kind of output, or they call it a control element. And so if the temperature is higher than it ought to be, higher than the set point, then you turn on the control element and it should blow the cold air, not the hot air. But if it's lower, it should blow the hot air, right? So that's the way, like the species typical thermometer, that's the way it works. But I think in the biological world, probably even in like the like machine-made world, there are problems that can creep into any point of those systems. Your ambient temperature detecting thing could be inaccurate. It could think it's 2 degrees hotter than it is always, or it could just be like kind of like randomly, unreliably wrong. And that, whatever that is, it's going to feed to the comparator. And the comparator could also be different from thermostat to thermostat. Some might have the desired temperature 78, some 76, so on. And so both of those things, if they're different, which they could, be different in different combinations across different thermostats or across different people, they're going to lead to different behaviors in the thermostat. Whereby, like some thermostats, you're going to be like, why is that thermostat going on all the time? Or why does it never go on at the times we need it to? And you might make some judgments or describe that thermostat in different ways, or just be like, I don't know, my house is too hot, or my house is too cold, or it's never the right temperature, or whatever. And I think that those folk judgments of like my thermostat isn't working correctly, or it's like always too hot or too cold, that's kind of like personality, the concepts of
Mm.
personality that we have. And then really like I think like if personality was a thing, like a real thing at the functional level, it would be the differences in those components of the system. And so I think for things like emotions, for example, using that thermostat example, like you have situation detectors that are looking for and integrating cues of adaptive problems, like what's the probability that I'm being devalued right now? That feeds to some comparator, like a set point of like what is an acceptable amount of devaluation. Like maybe for most people that's zero, but there could be some fluctuation in there due to genetic noise or who knows what. And then that's going to turn on the control elements that do stuff to fix the devaluation, right? And then just to complicate that one component a little bit more is like obviously we have more than just like turn on the hot air, turn on the cold air. There's like run away, there's lie, cover things up, fight people, like draw attention to yourself, don't draw attention to yourself. This menu of control elements that themselves have some utility assigned to them, maybe that you've learned throughout development or have some strong priors for or whatever. Um, and individual differences in those settings in tandem with the individual differences in the set points and uh, the situation detecting mechanisms, like they're going to lead to differences in behavior. It might be strategic, but it could just be like there's a ton of differences out there in the world. It's maybe random. Maybe they don't even really go together that much. And it's helpful for me as somebody interacting with a bunch of other thermostats or whatever to know what these differences tend to look like and just be able to describe them to other people and make predictions about like which thermostat I want in my house or, which person I'd want to cooperate with or, who's going to be good at this or not that. And I think that's what the difference detecting, mechanisms are trying to do is label things about people, recognize things about people, conspecifics that is good to know for decisions about who to cooperate with, who to mate with, etc. And because like obviously that was an oversimplified example of like how our psychological mechanisms would work using the thermostat example, but like already that's a lot to try and track for I would think for a brain. So like if you just have some summary variable that's like this thermostat is often wrong in this way, that could be enough to let you make these decisions without having to know exactly like where in that system things are wrong.
Hmm. So what is a niche? What is niche diversity, and how do niches contribute to personality variation?
Yeah. Well, defining a niche is, I think, harder than I gave it credit for. And this isn't my work. I would say like this is, uh, Aaron Lukaszewski, Mike Gervin, and Chris von Ruden who pushed this stuff forward. I just came along as a grad student and was like, look, I found this data, like, let's do it again.
Hmm.
Uh, and I do think that this work needs to be pushed on still quite a bit, but I guess the definition of a niche is like some segment of the social world that you're living in, that you make your living in. And it's the way in which you make your living within the social world. So like some birds, they look for seeds on the ground, some dig for worms, some burrow into trees. Like those are different niches. They have different affordances and different things that would be useful for doing well in that niche versus not doing well. They basically evoke different kinds of behaviors depending on what niche you're in.
Yeah.
And because of that, they're going to lead to different traits being prominent in some niches versus others. So if you're in a world, let's say you're a bouncer at a club, like what are some traits that you think would be helpful for you to do your job to make money there?
Yeah.
It'd be like, I don't know, maybe being a little disagreeable, being strong and scary,
Yeah.
being good with people, maybe, or versus a
Hmm.
banker, like maybe you just have to be really detail oriented or not get bored very easily or something like that. And so
Right.
there, of course, different people select into these things too, but
Yeah.
then you're still rewarded differently in these different niches for different behaviors. And
Right.
so the argument is that this, depending on the niches people go into, especially if people were to sort randomly into niches, then once you go into a niche, you get pulled in these different directions. So like
Yeah.
before I became an academic, maybe I didn't think all that deeply or spend all that much time reading, obtuse kind of academic papers. But
Yeah.
now, then once I went into that niche, then I spent more time doing that. So it changed my behaviors, it changed my thoughts, how I
Yeah.
feel about doing these things. And so that kind of pulls people's traits in different directions.
Hmm.
Uh, so at like a simple kind of level, descriptive level, like that's what we would expect to happen if people respond to the incentives of niches, which I think is kind of uncontroversial that people respond to incentives.
Yeah.
Um, and then the cool insight of that work uh, is that just with that simple process happening across different populations, if populations have more niches that are more unique, more different from one another, then you're going to get more types of people. Basically, is the takeaway that you're going to get more personality dimensions, more different combinations of traits that go together in more different ways.
Mm.
And there's simulations backing that up by Paul Smaldino, and then a couple empirical studies like at the country level, kind of giving some support for correlations that you would expect to find if these processes were actually operating on human personality. And so the takeaway from this is that like these dominant personality models like the Big Five, Hexagon, these kind of low dimensional models of personality, like they're not necessarily going to be human nature. Like
Yeah.
they're not the human personality structure. They're an emergent phenomenon that comes out of the way the human psychology, where even if it was so simple, all it does is respond to incentives, that interacting with environments, different environments will produce different combination of traits, which then look like more or less personality dimensions, depending on how many different niches there are. And so it's kind of pushing back against like the dominant view in psychology, which has become the dominant view since like the 80s, that the big five is what it is. Like that is human personality, and it's the
Right.
same more or less everywhere. And that somehow it's in us. Like Costa McCrae, like the biggest proponents of the five-factor model of personality, like I don't think it's uncharitable to say that they literally think there are like basic biological dimensions that correspond to extroversion and neuroticism and conscientiousness and openness and agreeableness.
Mm.
Um, Whereas this view says, no, there's nothing resembling the big five in our biology. There's a whole bunch of little machines doing different tasks to solve different adaptive problems, and we should figure out what those things are. But they might produce patterns of behavior that look like the big five, and we need to figure out maybe why. Why does that get produced? Part of the story might be this niche thing, but
That's interesting.
might be another story. Like I should point out, like Matt Zefferman, he has been doing some simulations related to this niche, kind of contradicting this niche diversity viewpoints, highlighting that some of what we find, or maybe even entirely what we find, could itself be a measurement artifact of the problem with exporting, these personality inventories developed for a particular population, like in, US, European populations, to other places. You're artificially like deflating the amount of personality variation that you see in these places. So that's totally I looking at a simulation is like I think it's a convincing argument. And it's something we need to do a lot more work to tease apart. But I think the strength of the niche diversity hypothesis, and I mean Matt's work, is like personality structure probably doesn't look exactly the same everywhere. And there's no reason to expect that it should, because
Yeah.
different minds will interact differently, or even the universal human mind interacting with different environmental contexts and cultural contexts will produce different patterns of covariation, which is what defines personality structure currently in personality science. Like, this is a whole different discussion. Like, that probably shouldn't be how we define personality structure, maybe, if we're looking for something more like deep part of human nature. We shouldn't be relying on like how do things tend to covary and how do we describe those covariations with our adjectives out there in the world. Maybe we should be thinking more about like what is the design of the human mind, what parameters are in there, what parameters might have correlations among them or have causal dependencies on one another that creates these different patterns of covariation that we see out there at the level of observable behavior.
Very cool stuff. Yeah, I mean, it suggests to me that we're too quick to reify
Mhm.
personality differences that um, exist in our particular cultural context, but need not exist. In the
Mhm.
same way that if we were to go into a jungle and try to map the variation in subsistence strategies of all the different animals in that jungle, and maybe we have a nocturnal diurnal dimension, or like he specializes in eating fruit versus leaves versus bugs dimension, and we say these are the only dimensions by which animals vary.
Mhm.
Well, if we go into the Arctic or into a desert, our map of the variation is going to be completely different, right?
Mhm.
It's not that these are inherent differences that all animals need to have. It depends on that particular ecology and what
Mhm.
types of affordances are available to the different animals there. And I think the same is true of our cultural ecology, that there are different opportunities for different types of people, and that leads to covariance. So, like in an environment where I can make a lot of money as a bouncer, physical strength and toughness and willingness to use force, like those things are going to intercorrelate on a questionnaire. But if I'm in a place where a bouncer does not exist as an occupation, or in a place where if I'm strong, maybe that's going to enable me to be a better hunter, and there's a norm that hunters have to share their meat. Well, then in that environment, maybe strength will correlate with generosity, right? And that's, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's an inherent connection between strength and generosity on the one hand, and strength and, toughness and meanness on the other hand. This is just dependent on the affordances in the environment and what opportunities are available to different types of people.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a big part of the story of personality structure for sure.
I mean,
I
and it
like
could be that just one quick thing, like it could be that there still is heritable variation in things like extroversion, openness, whatever,
Well, we know
and
there
that,
is, yeah,
yeah, we
large
know that there
amounts of it.
is.
Yeah.
Sure, and that could, tip the scales. Like if I'm deciding what niche to pursue, to fill or what status game to play, like if I'm naturally a little more, say, smart, maybe I'll go into this particular niche. Or if I'm naturally a little more physically strong, maybe I'll go into this niche. Or if I'm naturally a little more extroverted and socially adept, maybe I'll go into this niche.
Hmm.
So you'd still expect, individual differences to matter and sort of pushing you into one niche or another that you might have a comparative advantage in.
Hmm.
So that still makes sense. But, once you enter that niche, it's going to create a feedback loop where I continue to cultivate those traits, and that's going to cause different types of covariation. So maybe maybe initially I'm like just a tiny bit more extroverted than
Hmm.
average. But if I go into say marketing or a field that or networking, that's going to increase my extroversion even more because I've specialized in that niche. And so what
Hmm.
began as a very tiny difference gets magnified into a much larger difference as I continue to invest in that niche. But anyway, you were going to say something, Dave.
oh, Patrick, do you want to respond to that before I go on to something?
No, I mean, I do like even I think the behavioral genetics research backs this up. Like a large chunk of personality variation in the population can be attributed to like truly like random, like they don't, it's the non-shared
Mm.
environment. It's the gloomy
Yeah,
paradox. We don't know what it is. It's just like
yeah,
randomness.
yeah,
And then a big chunk of it is some genetic, proclivities, or at least if just having genes in common, right? But that doesn't mean that like there are extroversion genes or whatever, of course, right? Like the something being heritable doesn't make it, or attributed to genetics doesn't make it like a real entity.
yeah,
And then for personality, it's like the shared environment is super tiny. So I think a lot of it is like these small proclivities that maybe push you a little bit in one direction, and then just like the snowballing effect of like a lot of non-shared kind of things adding up over time as a result of that.
Yeah. Do you think my question was going to be, do you think like so with the big five, like extroversion, you should probably go through just for audience members who don't know like
Hmm.
what the big five or hexaco things are. You could just like list what they
Hmm.
are. But is this an accident? Like in the sense of, are there other common dimensions of variation that just haven't been stumbled upon? Um, or have they been stumbled upon because they are the most reliable dimensions of variation, whether or not they correspond to like the little machines. Like in the same way, like
Hmm.
I think the computer metaphor, which like I know the Aaron, so like
Hmm.
just imagine laptops, like some laptops are heavier or lighter, some
Yeah.
laptops are hotter or cooler. You can imagine like those there are deep dimensions of variation that are
Hmm.
pretty orthogonal to, or like, some may be faster, slower, or whatever, louder, or, so they're very indirectly related to the function, but they're pretty stable differences. And if you thought, well, the way that the laptop works is heaviness or lightness or fastness, you'd be wrong.
Yeah.
But you can see why those attributes hang together. Is that sort of, can you connect up this laptop metaphor to how you're thinking about
Yeah.
personality? And then the related question, sorry, this is a complicated one, is just then is the question of like, are what's up with these big five, and are there really big 12 and we haven't found the other seven or know where about to look for them? Or
Hmm.
what do you think about that?
Yeah, yeah. I'll take the that question first about like how do we get here? Are these useful? Um, and I think like okay, so the history of this stuff is right, like Gordon Allport and whoever like looked in the dictionary, got a bunch of words that people use to describe people's tendencies, and then took those words. And over decades, researchers gave these all these different adjectives and asked people, well, how much does it describe you, or how much does it describe your best friend, or all that stuff. So like hundreds, thousands of words. I want to say like 4,000 or 6,000 words or something like that. all these ratings. From those ratings, they can get the correlations among all these adjectives, and they boil them down with factor analysis or principal components analysis into some lower number of dimensions. And I think the first one, yeah, it says something like 16, but then they found some mistakes, and then like literally decades of people redoing this, like all through the 50s, 60s to the 80s, people were doing this and debating over personality structure. And they kept converging, as I understand it, and you can look back and see, they just keep finding something like the big five, which is uh, extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, neuroticism, and conscientiousness. And those describe the patterns of correlations that they found in those 6,000 adjectives, right? So it's a useful summary of all these different ways that people vary. And I don't think that's a mistake. Although the Hexaco does highlight that because the Hexaco, the difference there is just like in 2000 or whatever, they went back to the dictionary, they started over, and they added just some words that were excluded from like the original lexical approaches because they didn't want words that had to do with like moral evaluations to be considered for personality. And as I understand it, the Hexago folks, they included those words, redid everything again, and lo and behold, they get another dimension that basically has to do with like morals
How big of an asshole you
evaluations.
are,
Yeah, so
basically.
it's like, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So anything that we didn't include is not going to be there. If we included things like physical characteristics in that original
Mm,
word count, which some European personality psychologists probably would have wanted to do, or intelligence, like there's nothing about intelligence in there. Yeah, then we're missing those dimensions too.
mm,
And the point is that they're as useful as they're going to be for describing all the words that you wanted to that you included as being worthy of describing in the first place.
I see. But
And
coordinated, musical, funny, those are all left out.
yeah, they're not
Okay.
really in there. Like no doubt they're going to correlate with some of the big five anyway.
Mm,
But yeah, I think these things are. It solves the problem of like uh, coordination for personality psychology. What traits are we going to coordinate about studying? Because everybody originally was like studying their own random personality traits, give them their own random names, and at least this way we have some random names that everybody agrees on, and like we're going to study those things. And the problem, if which there is a problem with this stuff, is I think the sleight of hand of reification, circular reasoning, which some people, Simon Bogue, I think, has a really cool paper called like verbal magic, and it's this combination of circular reasoning and reification, where I think the field like did the sleight of hand, maybe completely unaware but where it's just like these things which were originally descriptive constructs became the explanatory construct. They they stand in place of like learning about what are the actual underlying mechanisms. So it's like it's going back to your computer analogy. It's like saying, oh, we learned like the most important ways that computers are different from one another is that they differ in speed and functionality and size and clarity of the screen. And therefore, like, I know how to make the best computer. Like, I know how to do it. And then, you sit down and you're like, okay, I got to just imbue this computer with speed and all these things. But you don't
clarity,
actually know how to do
clarity.
it.
Yeah, exactly.
You got no idea how to do it. And if you wanted to do that, you would need to understand, like, mechanistically how the things on the computer contribute to these emergent qualities of speed and functionality and size and clarity of the screen and all these things. And I think that's where we're at right now. Like we have a consumer guide to personality of like what are the main things that humans are paying attention to and labeling about other people, at least in the Western world. Uh, but we don't have a good idea of like what are the underlying mechanisms driving those things, or how do those underlying mechanisms produce different dimensions that people care about in other cultural contexts.
Yeah, there's also a meta science thing I've noticed when I wrote the difference detecting paper, and maybe this happens in personality too, which is you also fight the data. We have data and therefore it's real,
Yeah.
which is that if you have a ton of data for these personality characteristics, that magic inference of this is a real thing, that's sort of it's not warranted. In the same way you could say I have a ton of data that like some computers are faster and slower, but that
Hmm.
doesn't warrant the claim that like faster and slower is like how the machine works.
Yeah.
But people use that all the time to be like, of course, we've got tons of data. Like, look, people
Hmm.
vary on, like, we have a ton of data. Like, how can you say it's not a mechanism?
Yeah, totally. And I think there's actually a paper by Costa and McRae called like four, I don't know if it's four ways or five ways the big five are basic, where they're basically saying like this is all the evidence that these are real things. Like it's
Yeah,
heritable. We got all this
exactly.
cross-cultural stuff. And
Yeah.
like I feel like a paper needs to be written that just goes because none of them are actually reasons to believe that those are real things. They're
Yeah.
just convincing at an
Yeah.
intuitive level, like, oh yeah, this must be like thing. You think of things that are heritable or there's lots of genetics supporting that it's a real thing. But no,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
educational attainment is heritable, but like there isn't an educational attainment entity
Exactly. Yeah.
in
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
your head.
Yeah. There's no weight is
Um,
not a mechanism in a computer. Like it's
yeah.
just, it's a weird category mistake, it's
Hmm.
just, but yeah, it's real in a different way than you mean it. And you're meaning real in a very specific way that doesn't follow.
Yeah. That's actually something I kind of wanted to ask you. Like I was listening to the podcast about free will, and if I can, briefly summarize it, which yeah, hopefully this is
Yeah.
right.
You have
But
two
basically, like
hours.
your
I'm
yeah,
kidding.
your explanation of what free will is as a concept
Yeah.
anyway is that it's like the placeholder or it's a marker of things that are levers that I could pull on or could be pulled on in order to change somebody's behavior.
Yeah, that's how
How
David put it, actually,
is
better
that
than me.
fair?
So yeah, that
Okay.
was David's characterization, which I thought was lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. And so that got me because I was like, oh, yeah, like, yeah, what is free will as a concept? What is like personality as a concept? Why do we have that?
Mm,
And kind of like, I don't know if this is right, but my intuition is like almost like the flip side of that. It's kind of like
mm.
the things, if there's an equation of behavior, like free will is some of the variables that are open to be changed. You can put in a different number there, convince somebody to put a different number there. But personality as a concept, not like the individual personality dimensions, it's like a recognition of the things in there that are less able to be changed. I'm not
Oh,
going to say like
awesome.
totally
Yeah.
unable to be
Yeah.
changed, but it's like more like the constants in the equation or things that would take longer to change than just like trying to, change their mind, so to speak, or whatever.
That's awesome.
Um,
I like that. And maybe like I'm sure you thought like maybe then also like, like sex morph or age morphs would also go into that, right?
hmm
Where it's sort of like
Yeah.
you're not going to convince a baby to start walking, or
hmm
like, yeah, or I'm not going to convince a grumpy person to be cheerful. That's awesome. I love that. That's really cool.
Yeah. So, because I was like, yeah, I've never even thought about like what is it? What is it as a concept? What is this even for? Like,
Yeah,
why do
yeah.
we even
Why
have
would an
this thing?
evolved organism think personality exists, and
Yeah.
why would it
Yeah.
have that intuitive entry? But that's a
hmm
really, that's awesome. That's like a really clear functional reason why it would.
I love this because it's a good psychology of psychology, which it explains why personality psychologists were less interested in physical variation and say variation in intelligence, right? Because these are physical. If I'm taller or shorter or stronger or weaker or healthier or sicker or whatever, those aren't levers that I can really pull, right? And so it's natural that when we're thinking about personality, we're focusing on the stuff that we can change, right? Are the levers that we can pull. So we're not going to be interested in physical stuff. We're not going to be interested in how quick-witted or dim-witted you are
Yeah.
because that seems like it's harder to control. We're just going to focus on the stuff that or actually no, am I getting it backwards?
I
That
think
that it's
it's a little bit backwards, but
yeah.
not completely. Like I think
Yeah.
it's a marker of what things are less changeable than the levers
Mm,
you could pull on in like an everyday interaction to change
mm,
to get you to behave differently or like
Right.
change
mm.
the incentives. Like incentives can just be changed, I think, or like I could try to change a belief that you have that would then if I can change your belief like in the moment, it will have an impact on your behavior. Whereas I think personality is a stand-in for the things that are like less able to be changed.
Right.
Maybe not
Right.
totally unchangeable, but just a little
Mhm.
bit more fixed. Like, for example, how accurate your thermostat detection
Right.
ambient temperature is, or the set point. Like, maybe those are just a little bit harder to change. And as a human navigating the world, it's helpful to know that there are some things out there that are a little bit more fixed. And so, if I'm going to try to change somebody's behavior, it narrows the space of like, what should I be trying to poke on
Yeah.
in order to change their behavior? I should
Yeah.
poke on the free will things, not
Yeah.
Mm.
the
Got it.
where,
So
and
in
then to your point, like it highlights some of this, like the folk differences, the psychology of psychology. European personality psychologists included back in the day, from what I understand, intelligence was part of personality, height, physical stature, muscularity,
mm,
athleticism. These are personality traits for them. If the
interesting.
American school, like Gordon Allport, I think, who kind of excluded that kind of stuff. So these folk intuitions about what counts as personality is itself like baked into our concepts of personality, or no, our science of personality and our,
Hmm.
yeah, what we count. And it's possible, yeah, like your height is less changeable than maybe some of your anger proneness, but maybe weight isn't or musculature isn't, So anyway.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So it then would predict that domains of human variation that we intuitively think that we can change very easily, that those domains would be less likely to be considered personality traits, quote
Hmm.
unquote. I'm trying to think of a good example of something that we think can be easily changed. I don't know, like your willingness to make me a hot dog, right?
Hmm.
That totally depends on my on whether I can give you $10 to make me the hot dog if you're
Hmm.
a hot dog stand or whatever. It's totally in my power to control, right?
Hmm.
That's not a personality trait. The fact that you have a hot dog stand is not a part of your personality, right?
Hmm.
Um, so I don't know. That's a one way of thinking about it. The stuff that
Yeah.
is easy to manipulate through, say, money, through reciprocity, that those things will not be viewed as personality traits.
Hmm.
Whereas things that can't be changed so easily, those will be more likely to be viewed as personality traits.
Yeah, yeah. Or like in that equation of how likely I am to make you a hot dog, or like will I make you a hot dog, right? Like
Yeah.
there's some things that go into that equation. Like one of them is the incentive structure to motivate me, and the other part is maybe some aspect of like how much I like helping people in
Hmm.
general. And so like depending on that, how much I like helping people, which maybe is a little harder to change, let's say,
Hmm.
like then for you, it'd be helpful to know like kind of where I stand on that personality trait of being willing to help people in order to know how much you need to offer me or whether it's even possible to offer me enough to make you a hot dog, you know?
Hmm.
So
Right.
it's like it helps, I think it could help guide decisions if you have these little kind of placeholders in these equations of like other people's behavior to figure out like what are the levers I can pull on? How strong do I need to pull on those levers? For different people out there in the world.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
like that, like emotions too might be different or another
Hmm.
part or in between where it's sort of so personality is sort of differences, but then there's also emotions, which are sort of
Hmm.
universal and common, but also really dictate behavior. So, it might be like, well, you have a particular plan about hot dogs, and like, that's like really easy to push on the hot dog serving lever. But then, like, if you see something that's objectively scary, like a explosion or somebody gets killed, for example, there's things that like whether we intended or not or planned it or not, our evolved psychology sort of takes over of like we're in a dangerous situation and we can predict our behavior, other people's behavior is like we're having this emotion of fear
Hmm.
and it's independent of like that's sort of like a universal lever. But then there's individual differences. Like maybe Patrick is like deathly afraid of like snails and he sees a snail and he like runs away and but David, you and I would only run away if like we saw somebody killed, and
Hmm.
so we know that like that's like a personality difference attached to this universal. So I like this idea that it's all kind of compositional
Yeah,
predicting behavior or interventions on future behavior to get back to the interventionism. So yeah, I like personality fitting within that or emotions fitting in that and why we would have these entries. Or and then also like free will, like it's the planning. Like
yeah,
this is a really that's cool. I hadn't thought of that and I like that kind of
yeah. Like you could
plugging it
almost
all
kind of try to
together.
figure out like what are all these personality concepts or things that personality psychologists are studying.
Yeah.
Like how did we even create these things? Why would we create these things with our evolved psychology? And I like the emotions one too. Like somebody, I don't know who actually wrote this, but somebody once, an economist was explaining like a game theoretic model of anger to me. And it was basically like the argument was something like anger is almost like well, it's similar to Aaron Sells in this bargaining tactic, but it's like I'm in this new mode now.
Yeah.
The me that you know is gone, and
Exactly.
you're
Yeah.
arguing with this thing now.
Yeah.
So you need to
Exactly.
satisfy this
It's
thing.
yeah, bargaining.
And
Yeah.
having an emotion concept maybe like allows us to navigate that and yeah, either use that or
Yeah.
exploit it or navigate other people having those emotions, something like that.
Yeah, there's
But
a
I think
classic.
Yeah.
paper Hirschleifer, emotions of guarantee as guaranteers of threats and promises or something like that
Okay.
from like the 80s or something. Sorry, yeah, yeah.
Nice. Yeah. But I think you could see this stuff like in personality, I'm not super familiar with this debate, but I know that there are some personality researchers like who differ in whether they think motivations should be included in the definition of personality or not. And I think this is again where like our folk psychology is coming into play. If
Mm,
you feel like your motivations are like the things that you can pull on, change somebody's motivation in a given moment, versus you feel like motivations are more like these basic drives. So depending on which one you think is like what people mean by motivations, then you're going to be more or less likely to want to include that in the definition of personality. And at least these debates, or maybe we don't need to be having these debates, it's
yeah.
just like trying to figure out, yeah, exactly what the thing is that we're trying to talk about in the first place.
Yeah, like the essence of the nature. Like somebody's lazy versus industrious versus
Hmm.
stingy versus lecherous versus gluttonous. Like this, it feels very old-timey to have those be personality traits. But as you said, maybe it's predicated on like there's some essential human nature that if we include it, it's right, and if we don't include it, it's wrong, as opposed to the right way to think about it, which is these are all like difference detecting
Hmm.
systems, and there's no right or wrong. It's just
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
these. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
also maps onto our discourse, like the way we talk about these traits. Like if I say Dave is lazy and that's why he's not showing up to the podcasts, you might say, no, he's not lazy. He's just not sufficiently motivated. You're not giving him a good enough reason to show up to these podcasts. Maybe it's your fault, or maybe it's the listener's fault. They're not, being generous enough on our Patreon page, and that's why he's not showing up. It's not that he's inherently lazy. It's just the situation that he's in.
Mm.
And so the relative importance of the situation versus Dave's innate characteristic is going to determine whether Dave is quote unquote lazy or judged by us to be lazy. It's going to depend on the relative influence of different factors in determining his behavior. And a lot of our gossip, I think, is trying to pin down whether a person is inherently smart or lazy or shy or nervous or whatever,
Mhm.
or whether it's just a product of the specific situation that they happen to be in.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's really
Yeah.
cool. Is the personality literature, I mean, David, that's so lovely. Is the personality literature, Patrick, acknowledging that all this is for predicting behavior? Is that or is that not a part of
I
the
mean, it's probably acknowledged in there, but I wouldn't say it's the main take on what's going on. Like, it's, if anything, like the closest you're going to get to that is just like recognition that it's descriptions of behavior.
I see. Yeah.
Like the
Like
social
the act.
cognitive
Yeah.
theories of personality, for example. I'm thinking like Fleeson. Like they recognize that like these traits that we talk about as traits, like they're descriptive summaries of behavior. And there's a trait, what they call trait explanatory side of things. But like maybe this is too harsh, but I think they're like basically agnostic and or lost about what those things are. Whereas that's the value I think the adaptationist evolutionary approach brings is it tells us like what should we expect the things are that are explaining the personality traits in the descriptive sense that we see. Because it tells us, well, there should be things in the head that solve all these different problems, and we can get a sense of how they might work and what their different parameters are by doing a task analysis of those things and figuring out how would a robot solve that. And then you go and try to do that empirically and test, measure those little things, those parameters, and see if they do indeed link up to these descriptive labels that we give to people's personality traits. But so much of the field, especially because like so many people who use personality scales, they probably wouldn't identify as personality psychologists. They're just like using them because I don't know, correlations, p-values, whatever. And like it's just implicit in the way everybody thinks about these things and writes about them that they're somehow causing things. But these descriptive things can't cause much. Like they can probably have caused some things, maybe like, but they're not, I don't think they're the main causes of behavior because they're not real. They're abstract summaries of average tendencies. So
Right.
yeah.
Right. Like the faster computers can do this thing
Yeah,
better.
yeah,
That
yeah.
might
It'll
be
predict who,
true.
it'll
Yeah.
predict buying,
Yeah.
yeah, prices and stuff like that. But yeah, you don't want to mistake that for being causally relevant for like the performance itself.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Maybe one day we'll build a super fast computer that's faster than any computer before and it will take over the world. I feel like that's a lot of the arguments
Yes.
you hear about AI because it's
It's
reified
going
to
to be
this
so
abstract.
fast. Yeah, exactly. It's going
Yeah,
to be so
yeah.
fast. It's going to hit the threshold of fast, so fast that it's going to become human-like.
Yeah,
Hmm.
That's
exactly.
actually the base logic of it. Yes, exactly. The base logic is it's going to get so fast, it's going to become exactly like a human.
Right. It's the exact same thing where we're reifying intelligence as a real thing when it's a whole bunch of different things. And then we extrapolate that and like, oh, if we build an AI, it's going to be super intelligent and it's going to do all the things that we can do, but better. And it's just going to be like a wish granting genie that can do anything.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway.
Although even without that, I've seen some arguments about like even just if we were to increase like the speed of things by a lot, or and it could make copies of itself, you don't even need super intelligence. But it could take over the world. It could, with just increases in speed and productivity that go along with that, like somebody could use that to do a lot more, have huge impacts on the world, even without the computer being super intelligent.
Oh
So
yeah.
Yeah.
No,
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, no, no, no.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I mean, David's point, I think, right, is like we should be worried about any technology for the usual reasons of like
Yes.
hmm
humans using it to like coerce others and take stuff
Yes.
from them or hurt them,
Yeah.
and wield it that way, as opposed to like that there's some magical spirit that's all of a sudden going to become curiously like a human, but a superhuman. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
Patrick, should we have asked you anything?
yeah. I mean, I did actually, because I watched this or I listened to this, I did actually come prepared with one. It's not really a ask me something, but it's just like a hobby horse I want to get on
Yeah.
for a second.
yeah.
So I said, I don't know. Ask me how I feel about posters. Yeah.
Posters like in a dorm room or
No,
posters at a scientific
like at a
conference?
scientific conference.
Patrick, how do you feel about posters at a scientific conference, if I got the question right?
Yeah, yeah. I think that we need to stop printing out fancy posters and jumping through all these hoops. Just put up some pieces of paper, 5 pieces of paper
I've seen
that are
this. I've
nicely
seen the five
formatted.
pieces of
I do
paper. Yeah.
this.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I'm just like, why are we doing all this? Like, we don't need to have this extra random veneer. Like, it
Mm,
can be just as legible. Don't need to carry a giant tube around
yeah.
on a plane. In part because like I'm lazy, I don't want to do a big poster, and so I also don't like standing out. So I'd rather just everybody, got on board with printing out pieces of paper
You
and
heard it here
just
first. This
talking
is
about
very
that.
tractable. I think this is
I
very
think it's tractable.
reasonable.
It
This is
lowers
not
costs
a,
for students
yeah.
and universities.
But see,
And
then,
it,
Patrick, if we adopted this, it would be less of a compelling status signal because
I know,
it
yeah,
wouldn't be, it would be less costly of a signal. And
yeah,
then I couldn't use it to judge people based on,
yeah.
how much time and energy they put into it. And
And then what do people
I
do with
bet you
their
we can still,
posters? What do, I mean, because some people
yeah.
like
Like,
they
what do
put
you
them
do with
back up
them?
in their walls and like the
Yeah. I mean, if
psychology
you really want
building,
to
but
do it,
then
fine. If you're going to put them up somewhere. I've never put a poster up anywhere after it goes in the trash. Uh,
they
but
used to print cloth ones and you could use it like as a tablecloth. I mean, a lot
yeah.
of it is like provisional data often, so it's not even like
Mhm.
the final word on the thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I just mean, I don't know.
I like this.
Anyway,
Okay, so
it's
yeah, you
random,
heard it
but
here first. If you can,
yeah,
yeah.
so no, what's the like one sentence summary is like just no posters or
Basically do a data blitz,
just put a
presentation
bunch of
slides,
graphs and
and put
tables,
them up.
no
And
words.
like,
8.5 and
no, you need some
11.
words, but like, it
No,
can
it's
still be
not.
nice and aesthetic. It
Maybe
just, we don't need to, go
if you're
through all the
gonna put words
formatting
on a poster, I
problems.
might as well just read a paper, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. With some nice
I'm
headers, some headers and
headers
labels.
and captions on
Yeah,
the figures, and then if I have
yeah,
questions about what the figures mean and what the charts mean, I can ask the person, and the person's right there, and they can tell me in their own words what is
yeah,
happening, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And
I
instead of
see.
me just like awkwardly standing there and reading a paragraph that they've written, when
Yeah.
I could have just read
Yeah,
that paragraph in the privacy of my own home on my own time,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know?
I mean, I'm not even getting into that side of the poster stuff
The
that I don't
social, the
like, but
awkward social interaction
yeah,
of I'm
yeah,
gonna
yeah.
Yeah.
stand
I just
next to
mean
you while I
just like the
read what you
poster
wrote, which is
itself.
David's comment. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, we got to think
Anyway,
of better ways of communicating. Honestly, an interpretive dance would be better. Maybe we should have
Yeah.
poetry slams for our projects. It would be more effective, I think, more memorable.
You know,
Songs,
there
that
there
can't be
rap.
turned
used
into a status game, right?
there
Yeah,
used to be
yeah.
at HBES, the Human Behavior Evolution Society, back in the day, and I was a young graduate student while this was still happening. It was so not attended. It was like there were not many people going to it early days that it wasn't very competitive to get in. And there would literally always be one or two posters done by, I mean, to just put it like bluntly, like crazy people, where there'd be like glowing like
Mm.
chakras coming
Oh
out of
yeah.
people. And so there was always, like they were kind of referred to as like tinfoil hat. Like it would just be like this really weird, like, the seventh dimension harmonics are causing people to like act selfishly. And then there was just like so David, it reminded me of your just all pictures because those posters stood out because they had usually very strange graphics, almost religious like, and you could usually tell because either it would be 100-point font or a 1-point font, with 4 words or 10,000 words on the poster, and really interesting pictures. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe we haven't quite figured out the optimal way to have research conferences. Maybe this is the best we can do is the poster PowerPoint format. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
That's all
also,
I'm asking.
yeah, I think that's highly
Incremental
reasonable.
progress.
And to just make it a meta science point while we're on it is, as a PSA, like glossy, like really highly produced things are not a good proxy for truth either, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
somebody
That was the other
writing
thing.
something
Yeah.
in cardboard, yeah, like that's one issue. But like some of my favorite papers, like John Patton papers, are like low production quality, old school black and white. And like, there's a lot of journals now that have like really pretty pictures, but that doesn't mean that it's better science.
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, we're doing it.
We should just
Yeah.
hand drawn, 8.5 by 11.
I don't know about that, but
It rewards people with good legible writing, so and drawing.
Right. And if you're
But
starting a podcast, don't bother editing it and putting in high production values and
exactly, it's
cutting
really
out all
self-serving. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
the real podcasts, don't edit anything out and they just
No,
do real talk and they include all the ums and uhs and
that's right.
mistakes and
Yeah,
yeah,
and they're boring sometimes,
they're boring
and there's no show
sometimes.
notes.
Hmm.
Yeah, although
Those are the
AI
best
does
kinds of
those now.
podcasts.
Yes, exactly.
We should give a lot of status to those kinds of
A
podcasts.
Yeah.
lot of funding. More funding is needed, as Daniel
Yes.
Spitzer would say. Yes. Well, Patrick, what are you working on really quickly next? What's your next big thing?
All these things still probably
Yeah.
mainly trying to tie these parameters of emotions that I was kind of talking about, like situation detecting algorithm differences and set point differences to these broader personality traits. And then the other one is kind of this more meta question that we kind of hinted at here, trying to differentiate between, yeah, these more prediction-based subtasks of adaptive problems, like the one that David kind of mentioned of like just trying to predict like who among my peers is going to get status, or predict who will my peers tend to think is worthy of status, versus the causal side of things, which is how do I intervene on the world, or how can the world be intervened on in order to bring about certain changes. And I think figuring out like the space of adaptive, like the complexity of different adaptive problems and what kinds of cognitive machinery could solve those problems. That's kind of like something I'm excited about, but also like honestly very slowly getting into that. But yeah, if
Awesome.
anybody's interested in those things, like reach out. I'd love to talk and chat.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks so much for
Awesome.
being on. We really appreciate it. It's great talking
Thanks for
to
having
you.
me.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And thanks for doing the podcast.
Thank you for coming on. All right.
David, you're still here.
I'm still here. Are you still here?
I am. No, let me check. Oh, yep, still here. Okay.
Oh,
And you're
okay,
still
good.
here. So,
Yeah.
if you liked the episode, please subscribe.
Mhm.
You can click like. You can make comments on social media, preferably neutral to good. And we're on Patreon.
Yeah.
Tell a friend or
Yeah. I think
enemy,
that that's
neutral,
the,
third party, disinterested. Shout it in the streets. Buy
yeah.
David a fanny pack. Send him French fries. I think that's almost shouted from a mountaintop. Yell
Yeah.
it to people on the street. Don't do anything. Be kind to yourself. Give yourself some time and space. Take care of yourself. I think these
Say
are
no
all
to
the things.
drugs. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it depends on the drug and what the context is, but
Yeah.
say maybe to drugs.
Don't be arrogant. If you think you're arrogant, you're probably not. If you don't, you probably are. I think these are all
Hmm.
things we've covered in outros.
Yep. Yeah, maybe take a
Anything
walk.
new? Anything new? Fanny pack?
No, not really.
Okay. French fries. Okay.
I don't know. Watch Star Wars again.
The old
It holds
ones or the
up.
new
The old
ones?
ones, the OG,
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. 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 Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Good. Well, see you next week, David.
Yep. See you next week.